Good day and welcome. Today we shall be reading Youjo Senki, The Saga of Tanya the Evil, Volume 4, Dabit Deus his quoque finem, Chapter 6, Operation Door Knocker. But before we get to that, I just wanted to make a little brief interlude on a personal note. So first off, allow me to apologize for taking so long to actually get to the publication of this particular chapter. I've been rather busy between school and applying for summer jobs and also other various matters. But at present, I've finally managed to book in the time, so here at last we are. It is, as I've mentioned previously, presently Friday, April 26th, 2019. Now, there are a few things that I want to touch on. First off, as you already know, the Youjo Senki movie is out in Japan at present, and I'm pleased to announce, if you haven't heard already, that the movie has received a release in the United States, and it will be put up in theaters for viewing on May 16th, 2019. Now, I've already tentatively scheduled a pilgrimage of sorts, and I know I'm saying that sarcastically, to see the film down in the States if my schedule permits. Hopefully nothing crops up, we shall see. I've also heard that a DVD and Blu-ray release, as well as a streaming release, has been announced, although the details of that I don't presently have in front of me. In either case, I will now begin at last. Chapter 6, Operation Door Knocker. We begin here with a quote. "The Federation is a rotting door. Kick it down." A quote from the Imperial Army General Staff. June 25th, Unified Year, 1926. A General Staff recuperation facility on the outskirts of the imperial capital. A military facility under the jurisdiction of the General Staff on the outskirts of the imperial capital. In this quiet, quaint, and peaceful corner of the world, Lieutenant Colonel Tanya von Degrachoff is engaged in the desk work she has always dreamed of as rear-line personnel. She is working on the Combat Skills Research Report from the aerial battle in the West they'd been fighting just the other day. The law of this world is for everyone to do what they are suited to, and it is Tanya's fervent wish to perform analysis in the rear. To make that dream come true, she will probably have to rely on her results for all sorts of organizations and keep the focus on them. I'll get those results and obtain my place in the rear. As the first step, I am achieving some things in the Strategic Research Office. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, she is spending yet another day sorting out paperwork in the office that has been temporarily assigned to her. I'll reread that paragraph, pardon me. To make that dream come true, she will probably have to rely on her results for all sorts of organizations and keep the focus on them. I'll get those results and obtain my place in the rear. As the first step, I am achieving some things in the Strategic Research Office. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, she is spending yet another day sorting out paperwork in the office that she has been temporarily assigned to. From Tanya's perspective, the Empire is currently surrounded on all sides. Apparently, to our beloved imperial subjects and the great intellects of Supreme High Command, it looks like we are taking one step forward for every step back. But I think the prescriptions on their glasses are off. Tanya strongly recommends swapping out those eyeballs as well, if they can look directly at reality. It is true that the Imperial Army is maintaining the lines in high spirits. But does no one have the good sense to point out that being able to hold the lines is a whole different dimension from being able to win the war? With a sigh, She picks up the mug she had abandoned, and as she drinks the cold coffee, she makes a bitter face. The coffee's all gone downhill, too. Currently, she is at the General Staff Recuperation Facility. For better or worse, the General Staff hangs on to its aristocratic tastes, so they don't stock ersatz coffee. But the imports must have slowed to a trickle. With the Commonwealth Navy and the remnants of the Republican Navy controlling the sea, there probably isn't much that can be done about the matter. But if all we can get are these old, flavorless beans, it says a lot about the caffeine situation in the Empire, which in turn is a reference to their materiel situation as well. The quality of the coffee we've been able to get has decreased year over year since the fighting began. Surely this is the most eloquent barometer of the state of the war. And in reality, year over year, our enemies are only getting stronger. For instance, the increased presence of the United States in the West is something we simply can't ignore. As for evidence that the difficulty of getting good coffee beans is their fault, take the regular army forces calling themselves a volunteer army that is basically made up entirely of the United States' vanguard. Tanya was out there with fists flying like she meant to smash them with her coffee grudge, but finding them more powerful than expected, she was forced to acknowledge a brewing crisis. But setting aside the General Staff's thoughts, Supreme Command doesn't understand the gravity of their situation. She prepared an official report with all the details and particulars and sent it in marked, quote-unquote, urgent. But the response has been awfully muted. It seems they're underestimating things, and their ignorance makes Tanya want to cradle her head in despair. Being dense can be useful depending on the situation, but in the Empire's current one, it's not so great. If we continue to put up with this as it is, we'll be boiled frogs in no time. Sheesh, Tanya has to grumble. Turning my attention to my personal situation, I'd like to be happy that Tanya's been promoted, but irritatingly enough, it's difficult to wholeheartedly enjoy it. A win is a win. There's no doubt about that. Unit usage and operational maneuvers in the current war, which she wrote based on the mobile battles in the south, the initial maneuvers in response to the situation in the east, and the surveys and other research she did in the air battle to the west, was accepted without a hitch. And both that and her promotion to Magic Lieutenant Colonel were filled with the joy of hard work paying off at long last. Although it is unofficial, she's also received word from Lieutenant General von Zatour, along with his praise, that he looks forward to her participation in the newly established joint project between the Service Corps and Operations, the General Staff Strategic Research Office. So all Tanya can do is hope that they can win or at least avoid a fatal defeat. Defeated nations don't have much use for high-ranking soldiers and military careers, aside from in mercenary corporations. Tanya's been spending her precious time polishing her military record. In order to not waste this human capital investment, she hopes the Imperial Army will hang in there. Much of that hope is placed in the next leader of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion. So far, there haven't been any instructions about a successor, but probably it will end up being Captain Weiss, like she suggested previously. The only potential issue is his rank. He's been advancing at a pretty quick clip, too. According to the Imperial Army system, he'd have been promoted to Major to take command of the battalion, but apparently they need a little time to process the paperwork. In Tanya's case, General von Zatour used a loophole in the system to promote her to Major, ostensibly for forming the battalion. I suppose that they can't use the same trick too many times. They're not very flexible, are they? Tanya sighs at her desk. She'd like to complain. There are too many people trying to hold you back, but she suppresses the thought. That said, staying commander of the battalion a bit longer, at least in name, and letting Weiss collect more experience will help me avoid any griping about his promotion pace from the desk work group in the rear, too. Tanya stays on top of the necessary groundwork even though it's a pain. Still, it's not a bad gig. Having achieved a measure of success in the Western Aerial Battle and so on, the members of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion are resting in General Staff lodgings in the capital per standard rotation. Since they are lucky enough to report directly to the General Staff, her subordinates are living it up in a recuperation facility that normally only staff officers get to use. As for Tanya herself, until the General Staff finishes refereeing her paper, Unit Usage and Operational Maneuvers in the Current War, she is just filing the documents that come in from the Strategic Research Office, desk work that anyone could do, apart from needing security clearance, of course. Naturally, you can't discount the element of trust. Glancing down at the papers spread across her desk, she sees they are all classified documents stamped top secret, to be handled with caution. She is glad she has access to these state secrets. Since she can deepen her knowledge of the Imperial Army's condition and foreign affairs by analyzing all the intelligence collected by the General Staff on each front, it is a pretty interesting job. And Tanya enjoys it sincerely. Best of all, unlike frontline duty, she gets to be done at quitting time each day. Free from night interception patrol missions and going out to meet invaders at all hours, she relishes tranquil, safe sleep each night. To Tanya, keeping regular hours is the first step towards the return of normalcy. And a proper lifestyle rhythm makes her office work fruitful. For example, most recently, she had been working on a booklet aimed to specialists titled The Origin of Federation External Action. To outsiders, it may be surprising, but those tainted by communism and its party's ideology are in fact bigger believers in power politics than their ideology, and this pamphlet takes a critical look at that. I didn't have very high hopes for it, since given the subject matter, I figured only experts or people in diplomacy would look at it, if that, but apparently it's had a great reception from all sorts of people, including within the Imperial Army. Tanya is relieved that it seems her work is being properly acknowledged and bearing fruit. She may be confident in her desk work and analysis abilities, but it's great to be able to rack up accomplishments nonetheless. Yes, I intended to do desk work from the very beginning and hope to do so for the rest of my life. The laws of this world really are for everyone to do what they are best suited to. Every organization should prioritize talent management. After returning from the Western battle lines, this is really almost like a vacation. But Tanya looks steadily through the documents as part of her voluntary service. Although she's thinking along those lines that if failure is unavoidable, she can save up her assets in preparation for a worst-case scenario and consider defection. I'm going to reread that paragraph because that made no sense the way I've read that previously. After returning from the Western battle lines, this is really almost a vacation. But Tanya looks steadily through the documents as part of her voluntary service. Although she's thinking all along that if failure is unavoidable, she can always save up her assets in preparation for a worst-case scenario and consider defection. But, it should probably be said, the lines are apparently managing to hang in there. Luckily, according to reports from the front. Analysis of the attrition ratio bears out that they are in a very good situation, overwhelmingly superior even. Said ratio is being maintained at 7-to-1, and I may add, this statistic is being measured according to rigorous standards, nothing like those of the absurdly inflated, sloppy Formosa air battle reports. Now here we have a citation. Formosa air battle. An instance of mistakenly attributing military achievement. When Imperial headquarters tabulated the reports from each unit, the total sunk or destroyed was, quote, 19 aircraft carriers, 4 battleships, 7 merchant cruisers, and 15 boats of uncertain type. A major victory. Except in reality, they destroyed only a mere 2 merchant cruisers. Honestly, anyone who knows the battlefield would have taken such results with a grain of salt. But it also just comes down to the fact that people believe what they want to. Interesting. I wonder if that's in the context of our timeline or the show's timeline and the book's timeline. Regardless, continuing. General staff officers are going there in person, and before worrying about our own attrition, they are estimating enemy losses by speaking with prisoners and counting actual corpses. Even if soldiers grow on trees in the Federation, this rate of attrition has to be a heavy blow. So Tanya trusts that if the current situation continues, victory isn't unachievable, and they won't lose. If there's anything to worry about, it's the United States, the world's biggest weapons stockpile, attacking from behind. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Imperial industry has a good relationship with the United States' industry, despite being rivals in certain cutting-edge fields. It would be great if their industrial sector opposed the war, but in a military-industrial complex, industry doesn't have as much influence on politics as the world at large tends to think. On top of that, while the idea that the munitions industry makes bank during a war is a partial misunderstanding, the truth of it needs to be confronted. Specifically, the problem is that even if the corporation as a whole is running a huge deficit, individual employees and their clients in the military will make bank. Just the thought that they need to anticipate such people trying to incite participation in the war is enough to make Tanya gloomy. The Empire has the fight against the Federation in the East, as well as the confrontation in the West with the Commonwealth, which it hasn't managed to soundly solve as yet. The United States boasts industrial productivity worthy of being called an arsenal unto itself. It joining on the enemy's side when the Empire already has 2 fronts open would entail despair and only despair. The Empire's foreign policy task, therefore, is to peacefully soothe the states before its industry shifts into a wartime posture, even if the diplomatic effort takes a lot of kowtowing. I'd like to suggest that we do whatever it takes to appease public opinion there and buy time till it all breaks down. After all, the United States is naturally a democracy. Democratic countries go to war only when they are really angry. In other words, if we make the United States mad, that's it. Conversely, as long as we don't anger the voters, we can avoid a war. Departing from the text for a moment, I'm kind of inclined to disagree with that assessment. If you've read Democracy, the God That Failed, then they go into some degree of detail regarding that. More generally, democratic countries are a hell of a lot more likely to go to war in certain contexts, because if the state is basically an absolute monarchy ruled by a monarch, then the state is in effect the private property of the king, which means, therefore, that he is not going to go to war beyond a certain threshold, or he's certainly not going to fall for the total war, because if he knows that a total war situation will cost him his crown, then he obviously isn't going to go that route. Conversely, for a democratic ruler who's running a country as a caretaker, who's only there on a short-term basis, yes, he's more likely to listen to the voters and what they want in the short term, because there is no long-term considerations for him to care about. He can run his country in a huge deficit of wartime spending and basically loot as much as he can before he gets booted out of power. That's typically how these things run their course. So therefore, obviously, Tanya is speaking here, but it's Carlo Zen speaking through Tanya, the author, and in this particular instance, I'm inclined to disagree. Read some Hapa, boys. Read some Hapa. Anyway, after all, the United States is naturally a democracy. Democratic countries go to war only when they are really angry. In other words, if we make the United States mad, that's it. Conversely, as long as we don't anger voters, we can avoid a war. She intends to make an argument regarding the empire's strategic diplomacy with that as her main point in her next paper. But as she's taking her notes, she's interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Colonel von Degrachoff, may I? Sure. Come on in, Captain Weiss. Captain Weiss has essentially been put in command of the combat unit as of a few days ago. Officially, the vice commander is still her subordinate after she foisted the unit and its issues off onto him, but she's given him much of the discretionary authority. He used to be the second in command. The handoff has been going so smoothly that Tanya can't imagine what he's come to ask her so urgently while they are on leave in the rear on a personnel rotation. She's already told him to take charge as if he was in command. Tanya openly explained to the general staff that she was going to leave command up to her subordinate during their recuperation and reorganization period as part of his education. They approved it, so in a way it was an official trial period. Tanya hasn't spared any pains to get him recognized early on as her designated successor. So really, what is he here to see me about? Sorry to bother you, Colonel. I came with a request for you. Sorry to bother you, Colonel. I came with a request. For me? I'll certainly cooperate in whatever way I can. Or are you here to tell me not to poach any of your men? Lieutenant Serebriakov is my adjutant, but I don't mind... Lieutenant Serebriakov is my adjutant, but I don't plan on pulling anyone else out of the battalion. Not to brag, but the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion is an elite unit. Tanya built it that way. With their combat experience, they are seasoned veterans with nothing to be ashamed of as direct reports to the general staff. Surely they'll continue to fight with all their elite bravery. And as far as Tanya knows, the intellectual internal conflicts or antagonism that tend to be the biggest problems in units such as this one are virtually non-existent. In a nutshell, it's a very cozy battalion. Colonel von Degrachoff, I'm very grateful for all your kindness, but although my request is related to that, it's something quite different, I'm afraid. So then, what is it? It can't be that you want the instructor unit to teach, can it? I guarantee you're skilled enough. Weiss is early in his career, yet an old hand with the rare experience, in the Imperial Army at least, of having fought on every front. And although he's been under Tanya, his experience running the unit is the real deal. He bows with a thank you. But as far as she can tell from his expression, he was trying to bring up something difficult and couldn't find the words. Captain Weiss, this is you and me. If it's something within my authority, I shall spare no expense on providing assistance. If it's hard to say, I'm not going to force you, but I hope you can tell me what's on your mind. So Tanya, as a good boss, takes it upon herself to face up to her subordinate's worries with sincerity. Tanya is generous enough to help him if she can. When the trust is there, that is. Tanya is generous enough to help if she can. When and where the trust exists, that is. As a boss, there are some subordinates who are worthy assistants and worth any amount of your time, and some who aren't worth even 1 second. The former are those promising talents like Vice, who think for themselves but still ask for advice and counsel. The latter are the idiots who make calls on their own accord without even reading what's in the handbook. You're too kind, ma'am. You're an outstanding vice commander, so out with it. What is it? Therefore, Tanya von Degrachoff, who takes a liking to her subordinates based solely on their functionality, can be affectionate with him. Of course, it's kindness in the sense that she's not fool enough to shoot down her capable subordinates' fantastic ideas. Still self-interested, though. But it's true that she's kinder than you would expect. Knowing that, Vice finally makes up his mind to speak. Ma'am, please have the 203rd be a part of your Kampfgruppe. All of us in the battalion wish to continue serving under you. His eyes, shouting, "Please, Colonel," silently, as he looks at her, are earnest. She can tell he's not joking, but she still finds herself asking for clarifications. Kampfgruppe? Sorry, Captain, I know nothing about that. What's this Kampfgruppe you want to join? What can he possibly be talking about? Tanya cocks her head because she has no idea. She's supposed to be assigned to the Strategic Research Office in the rear. She's honored that they are volunteering to fight under her, but Tanya has no intention of going back to the front lines, and she doesn't see leading a Kampfgruppe anywhere on her horizon. Even if they volunteer, all she can do is say, "Sorry, but I don't understand." Frankly, Tanya's path shouldn't cross with the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalions ever again. Actually, Captain, I'd like to ask you, is this Kampfgruppe the one I proposed in my report? The General Staff is still reading that paper, and it was just one of many suggestions. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? Don't worry, Colonel. I won't leak it. Tanya's stance is to thoroughly deny it, but Vice is apparently convinced she's being strict about maintaining confidentiality. By the time he is nodding and saying, "I'm a soldier too, you know, Colonel. I don't mean to be impertinent, but I can imagine the sort of position that you're in." Tanya is at a loss for words. Vice's head is bopping to and fro as if to say, "You're so strict about your duties, Colonel, so I'm not surprised you would keep this under wraps," while Tanya is simply bewildered that he's interpreting it as a matter of confidentiality. Where could this bizarre rumor have come from? It happens just as she is about to ask him. God plays a prank on her right then. One of the security guards dispatched by the General Staff to the recuperation facility calls for her with a knock. What is it? Tanya prompts him to enter, and the young soldier briskly alerts her that she's been called for. "Colonel, General von Zatur is on the phone, ma'am." "What?" "I'm coming. Sorry, Captain. I'll be back in a bit." Tanya's quote-unquote one-ring instinct kicks in, and she leaps out of the office. She practically runs down the hall to the communications room and picks up the receiver. Since there isn't much chance of their being tapped, the General Staff employs telephones for communications in the government facilities. Well, it's not as if every desk has one. Still, the receiver is one familiar to a corporate warrior such as she. Tanya apologizes for keeping the generals waiting, and Zatur laughs that there's no need to. "All right, Colonel. I'll get straight to the point. Your report has been approved. The General Staff Strategic Research Office will probably implement your suggestions wholesale." Tanya replies that it is a great honor, and at that moment she feels wonderful indeed. A boss who gets it, having her work properly valued. It's almost too much. Truly an honor. Therefore, Colonel von Degrachoff, both the Service Corps and the Operations Division feel that you should be the one to do the research you've proposed. That's exactly what I want, sir. Oh, the joy of working full-time on investigative research. Tanya envisions a fist pump in her mind, but externally she exhibits only a prudent nod. The groundwork I laid is finally paid off. This is only an unofficial notice, but the General Staff has approved of you working full-time on investigative research. Thank you, General von Zetour. I intend to give this job everything I have. Great. I have high hopes of the proposal you outlined in Unit Usage and Operational Maneuvers in the current war. If you can verify them with even more rigorous investigations, I'll spare nothing in reflecting those accomplishments across the entire army. Work hard and diligently, Colonel von Degrichow. Of course, sir, she responds energetically, which is precisely why the next words out of his mouth freeze her solid. For the location, I'm thinking the eastern lines. Knowing you, I'm sure you'd prefer the familiar southern continent, but this time I'll be the one to apologize to General von Rommel. The East is strained and could use a Kampfgruppe that can perform. I want to send you back to the Eastern Front. For a brief moment, Tanya begins to sorely regret even picking up the receiver. There's some kind of misunderstanding, surely. There is a fatal discrepancy between my wishes and the General Staff's plan. I had sensed it before, but I thought I told Zetour multiple times that I wanted to work on investigative research in the rear. Instead, I'll be doing combat verification on the front lines? Those are orders I wish I could have gone my whole life without hearing. No transfer to any branch office could be as shocking as this. I survived that pain-in-the-ass inquiry and 2 months of field work in the West, and my heart's desire for rear-line service was supposed to be finally fulfilled for a while this month. But then I get reassigned after just 2 weeks? Do you mean to tell me the General Staff doesn't know why personnel prohibits abrupt changes in orders? A rage she must have put into words wells up inside her. A rage she must not put into words wells up inside her. Even Tanya has a hard time controlling it. But she manages to keep herself from shouting into the phone. She may be gripping the receiver abnormally tightly, but her ostensible attitude is the perfect self-control of a soldier who accepts transfer orders despite not wanting them. If it is an order, I naturally have no objections. To whom do I report? Even if they don't want to go, if that's what they're told to do, soldiers have no right to refuse. She's not allowed to say that I can investigate from the rear, or don't treat me as a handyman. But Tanya isn't taking the crisis facing her seriously enough. Her thoughts turned to molasses at the point she was told she would be sent back to the east. She misses the significance of Zetour uttering the horrible phrase, quote, a Kampfgruppe that can perform. Once told to go, soldiers by nature don't have the right to refuse. They talk about the, quote, silent navy. Well, Tanya must obey the regulations of the silent army. That's a reference to something that should have an editor's note, but appears to be absent. Continuing now. And Zetour keeps talking on the other end of the phone as if she'll be happy to hear it. Lately, she hasn't been able to tell what's on the general's mind, so she can't quite figure it out. You should be glad. We're letting you form a new Kampfgruppe, just as you've requested. Glad? Is Tanya's true feelings on the matter? I didn't want to go to the front lines in the first place. To Lieutenant Colonel Tanya von Degrichow, there is no reason she should voluntarily throw herself onto the forwardmost line. My earnest wish is to never set one foot outside the civilized and comparatively safe rear ever again. No, I'm not averse to joining the fight against communism. That's simply the duty of every good citizen. But I do have to wonder if I need to proactively take risks. For one rare moment, Tanya indulges in the prospect of escapism. Because, I should probably say, crushing commies feels good.
but I'd like someone else to take the risks where possible. And even if I've relied on others, I feel like I've contributed to the nation in a way that is beyond reproach. A Kampfgruppe? But Tanya is a soldier and a member of an organization, so she swallows her discontent, even though it would take an entire day to vent all of her protests. That wouldn't help her get the orders withdrawn. Tanya is wise enough to find something constructive in all this. For the moment, couldn't quote-unquote forming a new Kampfgruppe be an excuse to buy time? Remembering what happened when she formed her battalion, Tanya manages to be optimistic. Yes, we are going to let you implement the Kampfgruppe doctrine you proposed in your report in the field. Show us results. As long as you make appropriate use of the unit, I will respect your discretion as much as possible. Oh, that's when Tanya finally understands the cause of the discrepancy. Zatur let her play around in the West for 2 months, not because he was going to reassign her to the rear, but to have her lay the groundwork for performing investigative research in combat. And then Tanya proposed that the Empire should form Kampfgruppen in her paper, Unit Usage and Operational Maneuvers in the Current War. It was full of lessons about how effectively forces could be used based on Nazi Germany's World War II precedent for integrated operation. Well, that must have made Lieutenant Generals von Zatur and von Rüdersdorf very happy. What an excellent pair. They must have found the proposal so wonderful they got it into their heads to run an experiment in live combat. Damn you. Damn you both. If this was going to happen, maybe I should have turned in the report later. Whoever said it's no use crying over spilt milk sure knew what they were talking about. Tanya sincerely regrets her relative inattention lately and difficulty reading Zatur's intentions. Next time I want to do better. Ugh. We're making your old crew, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, the key unit. This goes without saying then, but you're not taking them away from you. Sorry. We're making your old crew, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, the key unit, the spear point. This goes without saying then, but we're not taking them away from you. So no need to worry about that. We are giving you a measure of discretion in personnel choices for the infantry battalion and artillery company as well. I'll send over candidates later on, along with your official orders. Well, I understand what Captain Weiss was talking about now, Tanya thinks, with a look of comprehension on her face as she acknowledges at long last what Zatur is saying. If I have to be stationed on the front lines, then being able to use my group of competent veterans is welcome news. If the higher-ups are being considerate in that way, well, it means I'm receiving some degree of consideration. I suppose I should be grateful. For now, though, I need to figure out how sensible they are. If you don't mind my asking, sir, what's the formation period? How many months do I have? Sorry, Colonel. I'd like to explain, but as per regulations, I can't over the phone. So, I'll be straight with you. I must inform you I can't get you any time, and I can't accept any arguments, objections, or complaints. I hope you understand. Tanya replies that there's nothing she can do if it's confidential, but then freezes upon hearing what Zatur says next. 5 days. Yes, the sound reaching her ears petrifies her, if just for a moment. She can't understand. She doesn't want to understand. So naturally, the urge to try never rises. Huh? I beg your pardon, General von Zatur, but what did you just say? I said, you have 5 days. I'm really leaning on your skill here. From the unit in the capital within 5 days, form the unit in the capital within 5 days and be in the Eastern Military District within 5 more. Then we get the Kampfgruppen on the front. When we get the Kampfgruppen on the front will depend on the conditions of the lines, but we're planning on somewhere between 3 weeks from now at the latest, Sorry, I'm going to reread this entire paragraph. Christ. Tanya replies that there's nothing she can do if it's confidential, but then freezes upon hearing what Zatour says next. 5 days. Yes, the sound reaching her ears petrifies her, if just for a moment. She can't understand. She doesn't want to understand. So naturally, the urge to try never rises. Huh? I beg your pardon, General von Zatour, but what did you just say? I said you have 5 days. I'm really leaning on your skills here. Form the unit in the capital within the next 5 days and be in the Eastern Military District within 5 more. When we get the Kampfgruppen on the front, will depend on the conditions of the lines, but we're planning on somewhere about 3 weeks from now at the latest, around July 16th. She thought for a moment that she had misheard, but when she asks him to repeat himself, the answer doesn't change. Behold, the rare sight of rusted silver in shock. Well, whether someone would be happy to see that or not is a delicate issue that depends on their humanity. It's probably not very fun for anyone to interpret the psyche of a monster in shock. In any case, the difficulty of the task has shaken Tanya. Violently so. 5 days. Only 5 days? And then to be sent into combat 3 weeks from now. What are they smoking? But quote-unquote at the latest must mean that getting sent into frontline service almost immediately upon arrival is also a distinct possibility. In that case, we could literally be in combat in 10 days' time. That's practically no time at all. To round them up, ship them out, and get them into battle in a few short days is a virtually impossible standard. No matter how you look at them, these orders are completely and utterly unreasonable. Anyone getting them would doubt their ears. They would have to. She is sure that any officer in the Imperial Army would react the very same way she is. General, if this is what you're ordering, I'll do everything I can, but there's simply no way we'll make it on time. This isn't just difficult, it's impossible. You could say that her implicit request that the orders be withdrawn is a peaceful protest. Let's set aside the question of whether or not she is really being told to build a Kampfgruppe for combat on the forwardmost line. What Tanya wants to ask is exceedingly simple. How am I even supposed to form this new type of unit? Colonel, I realize I'm asking the impossible, but you yourself wrote that Kampfgruppen are formed in an ad hoc way, and it would be desirable to do some investigative research into their swift formation. I want to know how fast the General Staff can put together units during wartime. Of course, since I know it's unreasonable, I'll treat this as an experiment and go a bit easy on you. Just do whatever it takes to get it done. Understood? Understood, sir. Unfortunately, however, Zatour's response over the phone to the counter-argument Tanya was clinging to is a military order that brokes no misunderstanding. In the organizational structure of the army, once an order is given, it invokes absolute command authority. After all, the military is the most strict hierarchical organization in the world. It's great that you don't have to listen to your subordinates' complaints, but when an order comes down from the top, there's no room for your opinions either. It's easy to be the one giving the orders, but as the one having to swallow my sarcasm and protests, I want to cry. The restriction of freedom makes me want to scream. This is why military states are so... The only thing you can say is that it's better than the commies. That said, Tanya is already bracing herself for the inevitable. She has to carry out her duty under the given conditions. If that's the case, then instead of crying, let's get to work with positivity. If you have to do something you don't want to do, it's much more constructive to simply get it over with. Your establishment ceremony will be 6 days from now. It's a completely new unit. Congratulations. This will be the first Kampfgruppe reporting directly to the General Staff. Zatur continues, saying the new unit, with the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion as its core, will be borrowing units from other areas. In other words, the General Staff will select appropriate units, which makes Tanya feel a bit more at ease. Tanya indicates her understanding, and Zatur says he nearly forgot something and informs her in an administrative tone. The codename is Salamander, so you'll be commanding the Salamander Kampfgruppen. Officially, it's called the Experimental Kampfgruppe under the General Staff, but that's simply too boring, so we decided on a codename. That's certainly a dramatic name, sir, and associated with the element of fire. It sounds strong. I like it. Tanya replies that she is pleased with the brave-sounding name, but what she's thinking about is the combination of that name plus the short amount of time. Is this some irony of history? For some reason, the words "People's Fighter Plane" come to mind. Okay, that's a reference to something, again, which should have a editor's note of there. When they say People's Fighter Plane, that sounds like something that's referencing either the People's Republic of China or possibly something out of the USSR. I don't know the details. I'll be sure to look that up and enclose pictures in the video accompanying this track. Continuing, though. Is this some dramatic irony of history? For some reason, the words "People's Fighter Plane" come to mind. And the bad feeling she has turns out to be right on the money. Exactly. I trust you, but we really do need some results. Your troops are the only veterans. Everyone else is newbies with a little bit thicker skin. Make it happen. She doesn't even have time to "yes, sir" before he hangs up. Having apparently said everything he wanted to say, Zatur just hangs up. Fuck, I said that twice. She doesn't even have time to "yes, sir." Having apparently said everything he wanted to say, Zatur just hangs up. For a moment, Tanya stands there holding the receiver in shock, wishing she could despair, but instead employs her iron will and spirit to confirm what she needs to do. If there's no time, she needs to start now, immediately, which means she doesn't have a moment to spare. She hurries back to her office where her former subordinate is waiting and decides to put on a devilish smile. Good news, Captain Weiss. Permission has been granted. I'll be taking you with me to hell for a while. I shall humbly accompany you, Kampfgruppen Commander. Weiss salutes with an exhilarated smile. He's a damn fine subordinate. One of that rare breed who have a wealth of experience and can be trusted absolutely. Unfortunately, he's also a war nut who proactively volunteers to go to the battlefield for frontline service. If such a promising talent as this loves combat so much, it has to be something fundamental about the Empire's systems and culture. Ah, it's sad, but reality is cruel. There may be a devil in this world, but there is no benevolent God. New scene here. November 28th, Unified Year 1980, New York, which is supposed to be New York. They're just spelling it differently and pronouncing it with a very thick accent. New York, New York. All right. Hello, everyone. Or perhaps, good evening. This is WTN Special Correspondent Andrew with you again. Today is Friday, Black Friday, and I'm coming to you from New York, where the Christmas sales battle is in full swing. It's almost Christmas, and just look at these crowds. I'll be buying a whole mess of presents for my wife and kids, too. Honestly, I'd like to forget about my WTN duties and go out shopping. But sadly, I don't think my boss would approve of that. Instead, I'm here combining work and leisure. Naturally, one theme is the usual puzzle solving. No, just because it's Christmas doesn't mean we're doing anything differently, I'm afraid. Never fear. That said, have you ever wanted a funny little story to tell your kids? If you have, then the WTN Special Report Team recommends The Salamander. Der Salamander. If your children aren't frightened by the usual Christmas threats of an elf pranks on bad little kids, this should do the trick. After all, this rumor is so sensational, even formidable soldiers fear it. I heard it from the fearless PMC personnel who escorted me in the Middle East as their number one fear. PMC, Private Military Corporation, effectively mercenary security guards. After all, this rumor is so sensational, even formidable soldiers fear it. I heard it from the fearless PMC personnel who escorted us in the Middle East as their number one fear. That's how terrifying the legend of Der Salamander is. From what I heard, the salamander is adorable and very clever. If you show it affection, it'll even get attached to you, like a German Shepherd type of dog. It can become a trustworthy member of the family. Sometimes it begs or plays tricks, but apparently everyone ends up overlooking those things. Of course, Miss Lagan grew angry and screamed that it went too far, but, well, in the end, everyone doted on the salamander, because when it's even more reliable than a German Shepherd, how could you not? At some point, though, the salamander's requests and pranks grew to be too much. But what do you think happened when no one was sympathetic to dependable Miss Lagan, who had continued to angrily scold it the whole time? That's right. No one was able to stop the salamander. Of course, the salamander loved and cherished everyone. But sadly, there was no one to teach it right from wrong. So the salamander never realized that everyone disliked it. Soon it had exhausted everyone's patience. But allow me to say, even so. Unfortunately, upon a closer look, the salamander seemed very strong. It was like a German Shepherd after all. Everyone started to wonder, what should we do? The tale ends differently depending on who tells it. But after hearing this story, parents can say this to their kids. Tom, aren't you being a bit of a salamander? Incidentally, I asked the former soldier who told me the story, and he said the salamander is actually children. Even soldiers have families, and I've heard that some of them who left their kids behind on the home front ended up spoiling them rotten. Yes, it must just be that perennial problem of parents around the world, these various worries about their children. And so, the moral of today's story is, don't spoil your kids too much. Please promise me you won't. Now then, where did this legend come from, you may ask? You may be surprised to hear that the answer is the battlefield. It's a story that spread among soldiers during the Great War. But what is it about? The truth seems to be, as just mentioned briefly, that soldiers on the front were thinking of their families at home. In other words, since they couldn't see their children, they ended up sending them too many presents and spoiling them. So when the war ended and they went home, they were shocked to find their children transformed into total spoiled brats. And thus we have anecdotes about the scolding of salamander kids on the first Christmas after coming home. Well, today we took a look at a timely story left to us from the war. I hope you can enjoy it when we take a bit of a different approach now and then. Have a good day, one and all. Merry Christmas. That's an interesting little parable there, and I honestly have to say I strongly suspect that some of those PMC fellows that are allegedly protecting this guy in 1980 may well have been part of this salamander battalion. Regardless here. June 27th, Unified Year, 1926. General Staff Office Main Building. Having swiftly relocated from the General Staff's recuperation facility to an office she was given in the main building in the capital, Tanya grapples with a sheaf of papers that spells out how not her way the situation is going. She's been fearing Lieutenant General von Zatour's frightening remark about, quote, newbies with a little bit thicker skin. but has been able to instinctively escape the terror temporarily by resolutely getting through all the procedures to set up the unit. But now the moment when she must face that fear has arrived at last. When First Lieutenant Grants, whom she had sent running all over the General Staff office as a gopher, requests permission to enter, she is already prepared. When he quietly puts the envelope he has just received from the nearby service corps onto her desk, she realizes the foretold documents have arrived at long last. When Tanya opens the carefully sealed envelope, all her resolve is for naught, and her face stiffens. For a moment, her white, porcelain-like features tremble, and she stares at the list as if it's her sworn enemy. What Grants delivered was the list of units the General Staff had on hand and the personnel they could offer to Tanya, which she had requested out of anxiety. Considering how scared she was of Zatour's remark about thick-skinned newbies, she had braced herself for an awful allotment of troops. Well, she thought she had braced herself. But when she actually takes a look, her readiness scatters to the wind. Ugh, of all the things they could have given us, we get a newly formed 2nd Reserve Infantry Battalion with no combat experience and a company of replaced artillery. Of all the things they could have given us, we get a newly formed 2nd Reserve Infantry Battalion with no combat experience and a company of replacement artillery? She murmurs in a shaking voice, "Am I misreading this?" She stared down at the document, but the letter she sees doesn't change. She's just barely able to control herself because Grants is still standing by, but if she had her way, she would have ripped the list to shreds and hurled it into the wastepaper basket. We compromised on an armored unit. We compromised, but this is the newbie infantry battalion they give me nonetheless? As far as she was told, the plan was to give the Salamander Kampfgruppen, along with the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion as its key unit, a unit of infantry that could handle field engineer missions, plus a company of supporting artillery. And despite being newly formed, they would be allotted an armored company. Apparently, she has no choice in this matter. But it's pretty awful to be getting a newly formed pile of amateurs. As someone about to be flung into the Far East, notorious as a fierce fighting ground, she would like to protest. Even Grants and the others she'd taken care of on the Rhine were trained before getting thrown into the fray. But these guys nowadays are drilled so quickly, quote-unquote forced culturing still seems too mild a metaphor. This is no joke. She has an opinion or two, but having been told the war is bearing down on them, she has no choice but to accept things as they are. That's why she at least wanted decent infantry, but from the document, it seems like that's out of the question. Still, everything has its limits, including how much one can tolerate. The list in her hands is so awful that Tanya's graceful features warp as if she's been suddenly struck with a headache. This isn't funny. Infantry and artillery we can't even use for war? I'm not even sure we could use them as shields, for Christ's sake. Have the General Staff officers... This isn't fucking funny. Infantry and artillery we can't even use for war? I'm not even sure we could use them as human shields. Have the General Staff officers mistaken me for some kind of recycling factory? What kind of bullshit is this? Grant stands stiffly at attention next to her as she explodes, and his face twitches. Well, it's no wonder. That's just how bad things are. It's unclear whether this new unit will be of any use. On top of that, its core firepower, the replacement artillery, has ridiculously outdated guns. They probably scraped the bottom of the barrel for these guys. Well, it's better than a completely new unit, granted, but I'm still anxious about their gear and ability. Having thought that far ahead, she can't find any point in thinking further. She judges that anything more would just be griping. I thought bankers were the ones who had to do legwork, she mutters to herself as she stands up. But since she has no choice, she sets off to tough out the legwork of consulting with the general staff about personnel. I never thought I'd have to do this sort of thing in the army, she laments internally as she, accompanied by stiff-faced Grants, makes a raid on the general staff equipment section. She grabs a group leader, Class Major, who happens to be there and, while reproaching him for his easygoing work style, protests with a calm demeanor even as her resolve is unyielding. To wit, unless we get the equipment we need to perform the General Staff's investigative research, we won't be able to meet their expectations, understand? Of course, not even Tanya wants to pick fights with staff in the rear. So though she protests, she keeps strict control of herself and doesn't deviate from proper etiquette and decorum. At least, not until the group leader says something he shouldn't have. You can say what you like, Colonel, but it's not as if we don't understand the hardship of the front. We always take great pains with our work, so I wish you would appreciate that. We do the best we can to issue equipment according to the quality of the troops. The moment the Major spouts that nonsense, relaxing on a sofa, drinking real coffee, Grants, who is standing next to Tanya when she breathes an "oh," unconsciously takes a step back. Tanya, when she breathes an "oh," unconsciously takes a step back. Later, he would whisper to the others that she had lost her temper. What a terrific joke I've just heard. It's a bureaucrat's reply, and not from an exhausted bureaucrat, but an officer from the rear brimming with energy. Tanya has a smile plastered on her face as a formality, but her tolerance has reached its boiling point. Casting off any semblance of politeness, it says politesse, I suppose they mean politeness, but it's spelt differently. Casting off any semblance of politeness, her face goes expressionless, and she takes a step closer as she opens her mouth in a murderous rage. A battalion with no veterans. If you're saying that's the best you can do, it would make more sense to replace you with a fucking cat. Most of the personnel on the list are either reserves or brand new recruits. The veterans who should be the key members pretty much all fall on the lowest level of the Army's evaluation scale. There are some NCOs, or non-commissioned officers, who might be worth their salt, but they've only just recovered from their Rhine wounds. Considering their decline in physical strength and how long they've been out of it, she's pretty sure that she's pretty much at her wit's end. Honestly, at this rate, puppets to use as decoys would have been better. And the 15-centimeter guns may be 15 centimeters, but the old model, really, not the new ones? That means their all-important range will be glaringly inferior to the enemy's. Maybe my battalion in the equipment section should have a live ammo exercise, Tanya continues, radiating waves of murder at the increasingly pale-faced equipment section major. If we had a shootout, I think you'd get your shit together pretty fucking quick. She can't believe they were so superficial as to look only at the 15-centimeter and none of the other specs. If these idiots are going to say that was their best work, then to Tanya, they're incorrigible slackers and deserve to die. It's insane to request someone to build up their firepower with old guns that have a short range. Tanya has too much experience suffering suppressive artillery fire on the Rhine, so a wave of bitterness is rising inside her at having a limit on how well they can compete when it comes to their own artillery. Which is why, when they try to force this on her, listen, Major, it's a bit hard to take that from the numbskull hanging my unit and me out to dry with inferior equipment when he's lounging like that. Sorry, I'm going to reread this. Which is why, when they try to force this on her, listen, Major, it's a bit hard to take that from the numbskull hanging my unit and me out to dry with inferior equipment when he's lounging around like this. You understand? These guys from the rear, who have never experienced a trench battle in their life, can't possibly understand the fear of being outranged. My apologies, Colonel, but we're doing our best to... This is your fucking best? This isn't a joke. The Imperial Army General Staff doesn't need a mouth. It needs combat experience. The armored unit is a bit better, but Mark 4Ds, on top of that not packing much punch, those have weak armor to boot.
Terribly sorry about that. I'm going to reread that section. Which is why, when they try to force this on her... Listen, Major, it's a bit hard to take that from the numbskull hanging my unit and me out to dry with inferior equipment when he's lounging around like that. These guys from the rear who have never experienced a trench battle in their life can't possibly understand the fear of being outgunned. My apologies, Colonel, but we're doing our best to... This is your fucking best? This isn't a joke. Major, the Imperial Army General Staff doesn't need a mouth. It needs combat experience. The armored unit is a bit better, but Mark 4Ds? Really? On top of not packing much punch, those have weak armor. She openly bombards him with her anger. Did he think I wouldn't understand anything about armored unit equipment? I can't believe he gave us the Mark 4D tank. It's an old model, already being used for training purposes and security in the rear. Maybe if we were an instructor unit or a security squad doing occupation duty, but for a unit that will be worked to the bone out front on the pretext of investigative research, this is intolerable. Tanya is getting posted to the forwardmost line, not occupied territory. Maybe partisans won't bring out anti-tank guns and heavy artillery, but on the main lines, the enemy's big guns, air forces, and mages come out saying, "What can your armored troops do against us?" Don't you have extra Gs like the ones they're using on the southern continent? If we don't at least get the current G models, we won't be able to do shit on the front lines. And luckily for Tanya, she received a personal letter from Corps Commander von Rommel just the other day. What she heard from him was anger at the interruption of supplies and fear that the situation would only grow worse. And according to him, though the wear and tear on the tanks is minimal, they are in desperate need of fuel and ammunition. But, he wrote, the equipment section won't change the ratio of tanks to other supplies that they provide us. She had replied that bureaucratically it didn't make sense, but yet here we are. It's absolutely true. Please don't be unreasonable, Colonel. There aren't any extra supplies anywhere to be had. The reply she receives is simple. There is no surplus. But Tanya knows that General von Rommel refused 2 companies' worth of Model Gs and said he wanted fuel instead. The 5th Light Division on the southern continent owes me a favor. I want their allotment of Gs. Send them the equipment... The 5th Light Division on the southern continent owes me a favor. I want their allotment of Gs. Send them the equivalent amount of fuel on their shipment instead. Tanya would be happy to get the equipment she needs. Rommel would be happy to get the fuel he urgently needs. This is a proposal based on utilitarian logic that will make everyone happy. Think about it. No one loses in this exchange. Only a commie would refuse a deal like this. I can't understand an irrational refusal at all. If humans slack off in their pursuit of happiness, then that's it for them. Do you mean that? That's absurd! How many rules are you going to make us break? Rule breaking? Tanya scoffs, thinking, I'm sure you can manage to break any rules you want. Contrary to what you might expect, if you look for the holes, rules are full of ways to justify your aims. And that applies in any context. Wait, maybe they're called the 211th Armored Division now. In either case, you should be able to give us the tanks on your discretionary authority. I will explain to General von Rommel personally. If you can, then
Please do, he said sarcastically. Who will be responsible for this? That is the look on the Major's face as those words slip out of his mouth. What a careless idiot. Tanya smirks, seizing on his commitment. Oh? Then it's decided then. I can't believe he couldn't even manage an equivocal reply. With a splendid grin, Tanya produces from her breast pocket a letter she had only just received from General von Rommel. Excuse me, Colonel, but what's this? It's a personal letter, but that's fine. I'll let you read it. So give me what you're supposed to. Huh? Tanya thrusts the letter from the dear Army Corps commander she had just said she would explain things to under the dazed numbskull's nose. When she'd received it the other day, she never dreamed she would use it in this context. Like this. The connections you have can be handy in the most unexpected of ways. Tanya reflects on how human society is ultimately about those connections, thankful for the one she has with General von Rommel. And since the Major doesn't seem to grasp the situation, Tanya is kind enough to read the letter aloud to him. I'll tell you what General von Rommel said. Quote, "If they won't make it here anyhow, I'd rather you use them. By the way, I propose allotting him some ammunition and fuel." Then she hits the stiffened Major with her trump card. Deputy Director of the Service Corps, General von Zatour, has approved of this idea. But if you have a reason to reject it, I'd like to hear it and pass the word on to him. Being a little pushy is fine. That's what happens when you do what it takes. Tanya brandishes the draft to which Lieutenant General von Zatour gave his tacit approval, and she can see from the equipment section's group leader's frozen expression that he's finally beginning to understand the situation. Okay, let me confirm with you, Major. I'd really appreciate it if you'd understand and respect my request. If a request for a loan of firepower from the commander of a Kampfgruppe who reports directly to the General Staff with the support of the Service Corps's boss already agreed to by the Army Corps commander, it is a request for a loan of firepower from the commander of a Kampfgruppe who reports directly to the General Staff with support of the Service Corps's boss already agreed to by the Army Corps commander. Of course. On behalf of the equipment section, I can say that we'd like to cooperate as much as possible, but... Colonel? Is something wrong? Tanya asks with her gaze. In response, the equipment section group leader is disapprovingly silent. Since he doesn't have a counter-argument to supply, Tanya senses she can push him around a bit further as long as she watches to make sure he's obeying. Swindling a company of Model Gs out of a manager in the bureaucratic equipment section shouldn't be a problem. At least she'd cleared that hurdle. But then she has a thought. I'm never going to get along with this guy. In that case, maybe it makes sense to treat this as a zero-sum game, go for broke, and get as much as I can out of him while the opportunity is before me. While I'm here... There is only action. After all, asking doesn't cost me anything. I'd like to request your assistance regarding the loot we seized from the Republic in the big push in the West. There were tanks, weren't there? Huh? Yes, ma'am. So we should have armored vehicles in reserve, correct? I'd like those, too, since they are just stolen goods anyhow. It's not like the Army will use them officially, so it should be possible. You'll have to excuse me, Colonel von Degrichoff, but you already have infantry in an armored unit. I can't just give you additional armored vehicles. Unfortunately for the Major insisting that he can't break the rules, Tanya is versed in all their details. The guy's declaring it can't be done with the bravado of one who just cut off a demon's head. I feel bad for him, really. I'd like you to fix the self-propelled guns. Regulations state that weapons can be repaired on the spot with the commander's authorization. The armored vehicles aren't for the infantry, but to improve the outdated guns we already have. So could you please promptly provide the fuel and vehicles for us? Oh my gosh, she's literally getting like, it's like those Toyota truck vehicles you see in conflicts in the Middle East, including like Syria and Western Iraq. Oh boy, the Toyota truck cannons. We now have, I guess, French flatbed trucks mounted with outdated guns. Great. This is going to be beautiful. The armored vehicles aren't for the infantry, but to improve the outdated guns we already have. So could you please promptly provide the requisite fuel and vehicles for us? Yes, demanding to replace the old guns with new ones is impossible, but efforts to improve and upgrade them are within the authority of the commander. Fixing guns to the armored vehicles seized from the Republic to make self-propelled guns surely counts as improvement. These vehicles are being stored because there is no use for them anyhow. So unless the General Staff has some logical reason to reject her proposal, it should be approved. In that case, they'll run on fuel, so she'll need an additional allotment of supplies, too. This much may be a gamble, but the SD oil fields are in the east, so Tanya expects she'll be able to borrow some from the Eastern Army Group. In a defensive battle, she'll be able to feed her vehicles a glut of as much freshly pumped oil as she wants. On that point, unlike the guys on the southern continent, she won't have to worry about fuel. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more sense it makes. Please, don't be ridiculous, Colonel. Fine. I won't ask you to make the improvements. We'll do them ourselves. So please get the armored vehicles out of the warehouse for us. Yeah? Perhaps it is a bit much to ask the equipment section to perform the quote-unquote repairs, she realizes. If she told them that their job was management and not refurbishment, well, that may be true. Fine. I won't ask you to make the improvements. We'll do them ourselves. So please get the armored vehicles out of the warehouse for us. Perhaps it's a bit much to ask the equipment section to perform the quote-unquote repairs, she realizes. If she was told that their job was management and not refurbishment, well, that may well be true. She sees the logic of the argument, so preemptively backs down. I guess I'll have to bug the technical arsenal to do a rush job for us, Tanya decides. Luckily for her, she has tons of acquaintances and business contacts she can't unmake back there. She could tap Shugel even. He may have that awful habit of praising God, but his skills are legitimate. And if she insists to her connections in the instructor unit that it's self-propelled gun equipment, she can expect them to cover the costs of the improvements too. So she extends a hand and urges the major to give up the goods. But that's crazy. No, I insist on taking them. With all due respect, Colonel, it's just, for some reason, this guy doesn't seem to get it. Even though Tanya is speaking humbly to him, he's gotten stubborn and keeps repeating, I just can't. So Tanya gives him a slight nod and gets to the point, laying out an ultimatum. Major, let's be blunt. Ist das ja oder nein? Alright, that ends that section on page 289. New scene here. June 28th, Unified Year, 1926. General Staff Office, Service Corps, Duty Director's Office. It was common to find subordinates coming in with a petition immediately after orders were issued. Any officer working in the General Staff undoubtedly had experienced a subordinate come crying to them that they didn't have enough troops. But this time, even Lieutenant General von Zatour couldn't understand his visitor's request. More accurately, perhaps you could say that though he understood the request itself, it was practically the most brazen one he had ever received, one that defied comprehension. "I want a replacement mage company?" he murmured, utterly stunned. As long as his eyes weren't malfunctioning, no matter how he read it, the form was a request for a whole new mage company. There was no room for misunderstanding there. There were no errors in the composition, and the document was formatted perfectly. Slowly placing it on his desk, Zatur, who lately sensed his fatigue building up, raised his head. Before his very eyes, standing at attention, were Lieutenant Colonel von Degrachoff and a woman bearing the first lieutenant's insignia. Colonel von Degrachoff brought the other one with her, so she must be... Ah, yes, her adjutant, Lieutenant Serebriakov, of course. "Is this a joke, Colonel von Degrachoff?" Without even thinking, he replied that he couldn't grasp her intentions. After all, the Salamander Kampfgruppe was being formed with the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion as its key unit. "I beg your pardon, General von Zatur, but this is no joke. I've concluded that in order to successfully operate in an integrated way, a company of mages is absolutely critical. Or I should say, an additional company. Colonel, you already have an augmented battalion. To put it another way, don't you already own a weapon of unparalleled strength? Take as many companies as you want from that." With that augmented battalion alone, the Kampfgruppe had the strength of a regiment's or brigade's worth of mages. Despite it being a newly formed unit, they were giving her a battalion of infantry and a company each of... Despite it being a newly formed unit, they were giving her a battalion of infantry and a company each of armored and artillery units. Yet she wanted more? She was essentially asking for an independent, augmented, mixed brigade's worth of muscle. Honestly, talk about overpowered. It wasn't the kind of force he could entrust to a mere lieutenant colonel. As you so wisely pointed out, that is correct. But if possible, we need a shield, even if it is a weak one. But she didn't even seem to react to his bothered tone. As far as he could tell, she seemed genuinely convinced that the company was necessary. He couldn't believe the sheer gall it must take to request that a company's worth of mages be squeezed out from somewhere at this stage in the war. Don't be ridiculous. Well, you said I could. Certainly he said he would be somewhat forgiving, but this? No. If she really needed it, he would consider it, but she'd already had the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, an augmented battalion at that. He'd had a hard enough time quieting the voices requesting companies for operations that were desperate for mages. Most of the usable mage units are on the front lines already. The reason the augmented battalion was kept at full head count, and the reason they'd been able to enjoy a rest in the capital, was that despite going too far and being a handful, their achievements were simply that significant. That was also why they were so in demand on the front lines. This goes without saying, but I need you to understand that despite the rapid increase in mage units, commanders on the front lines are still complaining they simply don't have enough personnel. Is it really that serious? Circumstances have changed since the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion was formed. We are hopelessly low on mages right now. The Eastern and Western fronts are practically competing for them. Anyone with an aptitude is already assigned to a front, and the rest haven't completed their education yet. Frankly, the mages they'd been able to cultivate were only a drop in the bucket of what they needed. The mage battalion of the Salamander Kampfgruppe was already augmented with an extra company, so giving them another one was... How much more of an impossible thing could you ask for? The army has already absorbed most everyone with any magic ability. Zatur grumbled in his head about the first place with a glance at Degrachoff. Even if she was an extreme example, the army had been aggressively working to take in quite literally anyone with aptitude to expand their magic forces. The Empire simply didn't have a surplus of mages to give. Perhaps other countries had the option to conscript groups of talent that were yet untapped, but the Empire had already done that, so it was suffering a shortage of personnel as a consequence. Well, maybe there were some undiscovered talents in the next generation, but it would take time for them to grow up. Degrichov before him, with her poker face, was certainly an exception. Somehow, he didn't think there could be that many damaged kids in the Empire like this young teen back from the battlefield. And actually, regardless of how he felt about it as a soldier, personally, the idea of interacting with them was terrifying. But General, I need them. Explain why in a bit more detail, if you please. General, it's the relationship between the hammer and the anvil. I can't swing the hammer of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion if the anvil holding the target is weak. Plus, the battalion has been trained for and is used to operating as 4 companies put together. Please think about it. Ah, Zatur at last understood what Degrichov was trying to say. She wanted to strengthen her hammer, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion. It could still be termed a selfish request, but the battalion probably was trained to work together in 4 companies as she claimed. Indeed, it was exactly as she said. I understand that, but hold on now. It's not that I don't have any ideas, it's just... Yes, General? There were some mages who weren't called up because the army wasn't sure if they were usable. They had also turned up the heat to raise a few out of season. If they scrounged those together, they could form a company. Even if it was impossible to get their hands on those, there were other mage candidates who hadn't quite made the cut. They could probably manage to scrounge up a company out of those. If that was all, then pulling from that group wouldn't be impossible. Sorry, but these are less like soldiers and more like little chicks. I'm telling you, they're barely half out of their shell. I could give them to you, but wouldn't they just be in your way? This time, I won't ask for anything fancy. As long as they're mages, I'll take them. But apparently, she would use whatever she could. She was both an advocate for and manifestation of that philosophy. Before she had lived even 10 years, she had leaped into the army and was spending her life on the battlefield, nonchalantly. Perhaps no one had the luxury of the right to be sane in this crazy world. Normalcy was an extravagance they would have to enjoy after the war. If mages who are just barely capable of providing direct support to infantry are all right, I can gather a few together. That's fine. By all means, sir. They were new recruits who hadn't even completed their mage training. Never mind become capable of fighting in maneuver battles. They might be able to support infantry, but the current war situation was worse than cutthroat. They would probably be used only in limited defensive battles, and fall not long into those. They would be such a crude unit that the acceptable attrition rate would have to be raised. But they really are green. They haven't even completed their training. The instructors said they were utterly useless. Really, we were planning on using them as infantry, but if that doesn't bother you, you can have them. Normally, the training period was 6 months, but they had gone through only half of that. They were infantry who, unable to keep up with the intense training, didn't quite make it to mage level. Of course, the instructors had crammed what knowledge they could into them, but they'd only scratched the surface of formulas and mage-specific training. The evaluation was that they might be good for catching bullets, if only that. Do they have firing squad experience? They should. Then that's fine. I have no problems as long as they can kill the enemy. I'll re-educate them in the field as we go. But Degrichov was unfazed and inquired about their experience with killing people. It was proof that she really was the singular anomaly known as Degrichov. She saw people as products, and she was asking if they had been tested. That was the nuance of her statement. Could such a completely utilitarian view of the human race ever be taught? Certainly, the Army is an organization that pays attention to individual functions. Substitutability and cost consciousness are two factors hounding everyone. But can you really judge a human being by those criteria alone? All right then, I'll make the arrangements right away. So, if there's anything else, you can tell me now. Thank you, but I think I need to confirm the condition of the infantry unit the Salamander Kampfgruppe is getting before that. I'm grateful for your kindness, sir. And he got a polite word of gratitude in reply. A salute that exhibited the model attitude of an officer... And he got a polite word of gratitude in reply. A salute that exhibited the model attitude an officer should have. Again, falling back to role theory here. Interesting. That innocent face and her straight back made her look something like a surreal doll. Doesn't anyone think this is strange? When an officer learns their superior is back from an inspection in a violent rage, all they can do is pray the storm doesn't hit them. So we've gotten to a transition here to a different scene, but they just do it as a jump cut. They don't actually tell us that we've changed sections. It's just a slight formatting difference to denote it. Alright, so new scene here then. When an officer learns their superior is back from an inspection in a violent rage, all they can do is pray the storm doesn't hit them. That day, the officers of the Empire's most experienced and much decorated unit, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, received terrifying word from First Lieutenant Serebriakov that the one superior they feared was in a mood like a hurricane. What fool played with fire on top of a powder magazine? It was with this lament that the officers of the battalion, in an effort to avoid setting off even the slightest spark, soberly went about finishing a thorough, perfectly synchronized inspection of their gear. Having prepared for the worst, they could rest easy knowing there were no flaws the murderous Lieutenant Colonel von Degrichoff could reprimand them for when she came crashing into their temporary garrison. They mentally applauded Serebriakov for slickly sending word on ahead. Colonel von Degrichoff usually saluted mechanically with an expressionless face. So if she was overtly displaying her emotions, something serious must surely be going on. Degrichoff's wrath. Those with good intuition escaped to training, as if unable to fathom being anywhere nearby. First Lieutenant Grants and his company came up with the idea of a long-range, low-altitude, decentralized raid exercise. It was a strenuous flight that involved concealing themselves and suppressing their mana signals to the greatest extent possible. Normally, even members of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion would balk at such difficult training. But that day, strangely, it was hugely popular. The ones who could flee were blessed indeed, but the ones who couldn't, the deputy personnel and Captain Weiss, had no choice but to enter the tiger's den despite the foreboding mood. Stealing a glance at their superior, Weiss wholeheartedly bemoaned their situation. Ugh. They're useless. I either want to retrain them immediately or shoot them all dead. The colonel must have been fantasizing about executions again. Perhaps unconsciously, she actually said aloud that she wanted to shoot someone, and her hand reached instinctively for the pistol at her hip. If she were a little girl reaching for her purse, it would have made for a pretty picture. But when her petite hand was unconsciously reaching for a firearm, all the scene inspired was sheer fear and terror. What in the world happened, ma'am? He didn't want to ask, but if he didn't, things were liable to get even worse. He knew it was a landmine, but he cautiously spoke up, thinking that he could recommend Grants, the sole defector, as the Kampfgruppe commander's adjutant in the event of his death. Disobedience and insubordination. Unfucking believable. Huh? Someone disobeyed you, Colonel? But her furious response blew every other thought out of his head. Disobedience and insubordination. Degrachoff was such a stickler for regulations that it was hard for Weiss to believe. But judging from her face, beet red with rage, something must have happened. Given that the colonel didn't hesitate to equate insubordination with execution by a firing squad, Weiss was genuinely surprised that there was anything and anyone in the Imperial Army stupid enough to disobey her. Honestly, it was a huge pain in the neck to get caught up in the crossfire, but he wanted to call those imbeciles over and hold them to account. Really, he wondered how they were even still alive. I don't get it. Please, explain what's going on. He looked to Serebriakov, who had accompanied Degrachoff in confusion. The infantry commanders say they have their own way of doing things, Serebriakov answered, her face tense. Degrachoff urged her to go on, so she reluctantly continued. She tentatively began to explain what happened in a matter-of-fact tone. How the new infantry battalion commanders underestimated the colonel. How they respectfully ignored the colonel's orders, citing their confidence as professionals. How they wanted the right to act on their own discretion. I couldn't believe it. It's not like the rules suddenly change when we're at war. How could they become officers without understanding that much at least? All the officers in the rear must be insane, Degrachoff snapped. I want to shoot them. Her entire body was a manifestation of that thought. Blood rage flowing in her veins. From the way Serebriakov flinched and cowered next to her, Weiss was able to imagine the scene quite naturally. It must have nearly given Serebriakov a heart attack. Who did such a thing? All of them! All the officers of the 332nd Infantry Battalion! When Weiss gave the room a quick scan, it was obvious that the deputy personnel were scared stiff. He had heard rumors that there weren't any good officers left alive in the rear. But were they really so stupid as to mistake a lion for a cat? What the hell? He found himself ever so slightly understanding why the colonel said she wanted to have the firing squad take care of these failures. Using those guys is just simply out of the question, so I'm going to get replacements. How will you do that? Weiss was incredibly careful about how he asked, which was why her answer petrified him. Well, that's obvious. Go and bring back the Guard Division's new... that's obvious. Go and bring back the Guard Division's new Fallschirmjäger Battalion. Huh? What Guard Division? Fallschirmjäger. What is she even talking about? The 2nd Guard Division is on leave for reorganization for a while, right? Yes, Colonel, that's right. Weiss had to reply. Wonderful, Degrachoff smiled. On the Rhine front, the 2nd Guard Division was too stupid to do anything but hide behind us. Makes me wonder how they can actually guard anything. I seem to have butchered that German word in the past little sentence there, so we're going to take it back a ways and then continue on. He had heard rumors that there weren't any good officers left in the rear, but were they really so stupid as to mistake a lion for a cat? What the hell? He found himself ever so slightly understanding why the colonel said she wanted to have the firing squad take care of the failures. Using those guys is out of the question, so I'm going to go get replacements. How are you going to do that? Weiss was incredibly careful about how he asked, which was why her answer petrified him. Well, that's obvious. Go and bring back the Guard Division's new Fallschirmjäger Battalion. Huh? What Guard Division? Fallschirmjäger? What is she even talking about? The 2nd Guard Division is on leave for reorganization for a while, right? Yes, Colonel, that's right, Weiss had to reply. Wonderful, Tanya smiled. On the Rhine front, the 2nd Guard Division was too stupid to do anything but hide behind us. Makes me wonder how they can actually guard anything. Yes, Colonel, quite right. Weiss found himself nodding, as he knew the relationship between the Guard Divisions and the court. We're going to make meaningful use of that force. We'll trade. Even these idiots should be able to pretend to do ornamental defensive missions. Yes, Colonel, it's just as you say, of course, said Weiss with an emphatic nod. In his head, he prayed for her to stop unconsciously teaching yes, Colonel, it's just as you say, said Weiss with an emphatic nod. In his head, though, he prayed for her to stop unconsciously reaching for the computation orb around her neck. So, you're going to ask the General Staff, then? Please, please, dear God, don't explode. He was practically clinging to God's aid as he nervously broached the question. He would have felt more optimistic leaping into a forest of swords and hails of bullets. After all, in that scenario at least, he wouldn't be up against Colonel von Degrichow. Then a miracle occurred. At least, the members of the 203rd Aerial Assault Mage Battalion headquarters who were present that day thought so. Oh, no need to worry. The commander of the battalion in the 2nd Guard Division already approved it. Until just a moment ago, the colonel's expression would have made even Hell's prison guards run for the hills. But now she was the perfect picture of cheer. A gaily sublime smile like an angel's bloomed across her face. How in the world did you convince him? Oh, that was easy. They're war maniacs, every one. They're so thirsty for blood, it was a home run, really. Correction. She's a seductive devil. No question about it. Or at the very least, she was terrifying. She was a great mage, and she was a great commander. Dear God, please allow me to thank you for not making the colonel our enemy. Plus, the one in charge of formation, Colonel von Legren, knows what's what. I don't think there will be any problems. Weiss mentally decided that he would go to church this Sunday. With no idea what he was thinking, Tanya smiles happily at how smoothly things are progressing. After all, she finally has an idea how things will go. Ah, it pays to push people for a yes or no answer, she reflects. Everyone said yes. Apparently, there is a point to bowing your head and saying please after all. Now she'll have a better chance of surviving the perilous front lines in the months to come. I'm just going to do my best for a brighter future. If I manage to survive, I should be able to at least escape to the west. New scene here. July 1st, Unified Year, 1926. General Staff Office, large conference room. It was an awfully strange scene. We had been gathered for the ceremony to establish the new Kampfgruppe. The venue, perhaps as a sign of the General Staff's sponsorship, was a room in the General Staff office. The higher-ups seemed plenty excited about it. High-ranking officers were sprinkled among the attendees. That was fine. It simply meant we had guests to witness the establishment of the unit. The Guard Division had been on many assignments dealing with formal events, so we had experience. Welcome, battalion members. I'll be counting on you. But what is that? The commander had to get up on a specially ordered dais to survey the room or even see over the first row of attendees. That absurd, expressionless, doll-like caricature of a creature was giving orders to people who appeared to be bloodthirsty mages just back from a war zone. She smiled at them, savagely, and they watched her every move so as not to miss a thing. Something seemed very wrong with this picture. Colonel, Commander, the way they shouted, so focused, made us realize how much they trusted her. They would follow her to the depths of hell and back. Even we, Fallschirmjäger of the 2nd Guard Division, who qualify as elites, had to hand it to them. And yet there they were. Yes, these soldiers who distinguished themselves in that hell on the Rhine were paying their wholehearted respects to this little kid. My wonderful battalion. Brothers who have gone with me to paint the towns red. Let us celebrate the new friends joining our ranks. This figure, smiling like a seasoned officer, was beyond the realm of our comprehension. New troops, welcome to the forwardmost line. Her smile was savage like a drill sergeant's. Could it really? Could she really be? New troops, welcome to the forwardmost line. Her smile was savage like a drill sergeant's. Could it really? Could it really be possible for a child to wear such a smile? Welcome to my, nay, our battalion. We invite you wholeheartedly. Her hands were soft and would have looked more natural holding a doll, but instead this odd, human-shaped caricature of a creature spread her arms as she delivered a welcoming address to the room. No one. None of the high-ranking officers present could raise any objection to this thing. The veteran mages all obeyed this inhuman being in the form of a person. Not that we should wonder why our war-freak battalion commander would go along with this. We should have come prepared. We should have known that war nut had fallen under her spell. There are only 2 things I expect from you, gentlemen. It was almost like we had heard this before somewhere. Don't get in my battalion's way. Keep up. That is all. And then the colonel smiled, or at least we supposed that must be what she thought was a smile. Whoever said a smile is by nature a hostile action was right. Smiling is, without a doubt, the act of baring your fangs. It's an unmistakable threat. New scene here. July 2nd, Unified Year 1926. General Staff Office, Service Corps, Deputy Director's Office. Lieutenant General von Zetour was looking over the reports from the front lines while having a late meal in his office. Tense, hurried footsteps interrupted him in his duties. When he looked up and saw his subordinate standing there, he was confused for a moment. It was the promising talent, Colonel von Legren. The Service Corps and operations in the General Staff had fought over him, and Zetour himself thought highly of the man. When he flew furiously into his office, Zetour furrowed his brow slightly and asked, "What on earth is it?" "General von Zetour, are you really putting Colonel von Degrachaff in charge of a Kampfgruppe?" The question was cleared up the moment Legren opened his mouth. For better or worse, he was one of the Army's sensible officers. To put it another way, he was someone who was apprehensive of Degrachaff's more over-the-top actions. During the inquiry, he had defended Degrachaff's conduct, but ultimately he thought privately that she would inevitably ruin them. Therefore, he didn't trust her. And his fears were well-founded. As was known both in and outside the General Staff, even Zetour, who valued her so highly, originally had the same worries as Legren. But to him, such concerns were already meaningless. In order to win, he was prepared to swallow any pill, no matter how bitter. This was war. They couldn't afford to be picky about their methods. Zetour had decided that even if the side effects were agonizing, they could regret it as much as they wanted after winning. "What I'd like to know," said Zetour, "is where you heard about this." Colonel von Legren. "How did you gain access to this information from operations? It should be confidential even within the Service Corps." "General, forgive me for saying so, but Colonel von Degrachaff has already gone too far. I've just received a report that she's co-opted a battalion from the 2nd Guard Division garrison in the capital with the excuse that it's necessary for her investigative research for the General Staff." Spittle flew from his mouth. He was so furious. Apparently, he had caught wind of the Kampfgruppe's formation via an incident that affected his own department. Well, I guess Well then, I guess he's as outstanding as always, thought Zatur with a sigh. But that must be Colonel von Degrachof's way of quote-unquote appropriately handling things. In the army, quote-unquote appropriate use essentially meant exploiting everything available. Though he had said, quote, a measure of discretion, end quote, this did happen directly after he told her they would give it to her. He realized they were lucky she hadn't co-opted weapons. It amounted to borderline interference in Supreme Command, but this was Degrachov they were talking about. Surely she had some sort of justification prepared, in which case there wasn't any legal problem. He didn't feel like complaining about it. Either way, the 2nd Guard Division is, along with the 1st, charged with defending the capital. Considering their connections with the court, they would never be deployed in combat. But they have high-quality equipment and training. Maybe we should be impressed with her taking advantage of what's on hand. True, the 2nd Guard Division isn't doing much of anything at the moment, but she's clearly overstepping the bounds of her authority. That's enough. You probably shouldn't say any more, Colonel. He didn't feel like hearing anything else, and he made that loud and clear. General! Colonel von Degrachov is an expert field officer. The Guard Division soldiers are elite, unlike the key members connected to the court. Don't you think that's an optimal combination? But Legren tried to protest, but Zatur sighed at him instead. Look, we can't afford to let them twiddle their thumbs and sit idly by. The requests from the front lines conveyed how grave the situation had gotten. Degrachov had offered a plan to ameliorate it, and it was to flexibly employ a Kampfgruppe made up of multiple military branches in the Imperial Army's preferred efficient method. That said, while Degrachov's report was brilliant, it was undeniable that at this rate it would remain armchair theory. How much doctrine can you really claim if it's untested? In order to actually verify its practicality in combat and mitigate the difficulties on the front lines, it's hard to avoid employing the unit in a test. And the only way to do it is to put the one who came up with the idea in charge. You understand that, right? Zatur asked with his eyes, and Legren was left speechless. It was true. It was common understanding that there were virtually no magic officers who were also such outstanding field commanders. No, you could say they simply did not exist. And Degrachov was essentially the only one who could use the General Staff's firefighting team, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, to its full potential. If the battalion built up by that great commander was going to be the core of the new Kampfgruppe, then ultimately its commander would have to be Degrachov herself. Since that's the case, I've decided that now is the time to deploy it on the front lines. Colonel von Legren, I don't think a staff officer of your caliber would require any more explanation than that. But what else do you want me to say? Sorry, but what do you say? I humbly thank you for your kindness and the quite undeserved praise. But if that's how you feel, then please forgive me for offering you my opinion. You should at least station Colonel von Degrachov and her Kampfgruppe on the southern continent. We can't hold out down there anymore. General von Rommel has been fighting for almost a year, but we can't get dragged into a materiel war. Not at this time. The Southern Continent Expeditionary Army Corps had been dispatched as a way to gently shake up the status quo of the fight. Zatur made the choice to send them unwillingly. It was for political purposes. They were managing to achieve continual tactical victories, but, as expected, the reports that came in said they were struggling against the enemy's materiel strength. The Commonwealth was propping up the Republicans substantially, and the insincere the Commonwealth was propping up the Republicans substantially, and the insincere neutral stance of the Empire's dear ally, the Kingdom of Ildoa, was incredibly fishy. And on top of that, due to the frequent raids on the transport fleet by the Commonwealth Navy and Marine mages, the supply situation of the thinly spread expeditionary forces had gone from beyond pitiable to nearly disastrous. General von Rommel was an expert in maneuver warfare, true, but with a fundamental force imbalance, there was little hope that he would be able to counterattack. General von Rommel was an expert in maneuver warfare, but with a fundamental force imbalance, there was little hope that he would be able to counteract strategic inferiority with tactical victories. As they had already achieved their initial objective of creating a distraction, the idea of committing more troops at this point could be met only with confusion. But we can shore up the materiel disparity. Wouldn't that be the place for Degrichov to shine, as you believe she will? Couldn't she take on the Commonwealth Marine mages and win? For a time, yes, I'm sure she could. But it would only be a drop in the bucket. The fundamental quantities of materiel being committed were simply too different. All Zatur could do was make a face like he'd been sucking lemons and lament the shamefulness of the Imperial Army. Multiple reports are saying the materiel is being supplied directly to the Commonwealth Army and the remnants of the Republican Army, or I should say the Free Republic, was it, from an unconfirmed source. It was exactly as they had feared, exactly as Degrichov had predicted. He wanted to cry. Is Degrichov a devil? Just as her report had predicted, massive amounts of United States-made military goods were flowing into the southern continent via the Commonwealth as camouflage. And apparently, they were coming from the United States directly. What's worse, they were purposely doing the deals with private enterprises and transporting things on ships of neutral nationality. Even if the Empire wanted to sink them, the ships were from a third-party country, or that one. Sinking or inspection of American shipping could invite the United States into the war. At least, that's what Degrichov's paper from so long ago had claimed. Her assertion that the executives of the United States were hoping the Imperial Army would do just that actually had a high probability of ringing true as well. Colonel von Legren, we know due to a curious leak that a certain country is sending materiel directly to the southern continent. Huh? The leak was made on purpose. Basically, someone from either the Commonwealth or the United States with a perverted interest in provoking an imperial attack on United States shipping was kind enough to tip them off. The only way to avoid a conflict would be to bomb the port of discharge. But on the southern continent, even that would prove difficult. It would have to be a raid from high altitude. Given the slim chances of hitting their target, the only way to do it would be to carpet bomb the area off the face of the earth. The Imperial Air Fleet was already fully engaged on the western and eastern fronts. Under these circumstances, concentrating the necessary amount of bombers on the southern continent was impossible. And they were likewise strapped for mages. It would be too hard to pull a whole unit off the main lines for long enough to get the job done. Thus, currently, they had no move to make. There's a leak regarding that country's assistance in this matter. Apparently, the amount of supplies flowing in is undeniably huge. Vexingly, we have no way to stop it. The United States is sending supplies to the southern continent directly. We know they have troops working with the Commonwealth forces, but direct support to a combat zone wasn't Congress's policy to be a neutral third party? The President of the United States seems to have taken a different stance than his Congress. Apparently, the good ladies and gentlemen of the United States consider their country to be ostensibly neutral, and it was an utter pain in the ass, but they were even wanted to continue normal trade relations with the Empire. If that was all, Zatour winced. If that was all, they would surely be desirable trading partners. But the President of the United States seemed to be of a different mind than the voters. What will you do? Our empire may be great, but we have our hands full with the Federation and the Commonwealth. I want to avoid starting anything else at this time. Ultimately, if they had no way to mitigate harm, getting involved would prove too costly. He could only think that the United States' pro-war faction was openly provoking him, egging them on to attack. There was no need for the Empire to go biting the poisonous apple of their own accord. Of course, it's aggravating to helplessly watch our enemy enjoying those benefits, which was why they had to win in the East at all costs. If that much could be achieved, nothing was off limits. All that mattered was whether it would benefit the Empire or not. Everything had to be considered accordingly through that lens. That's how it is, Colonel. To win, we need to get results in the East. So I'm going to have Degrachav wreak havoc on the eastern lines. Yes, sir. Midway through the Great War... yes, another change of scenery here, I suspect. Midway through the Great War, a serious conflict arose within the Imperial Army General Staff regarding overall war policy. General von Zatour, who had led their efforts on the Rhine front overall, and his followers made up the Western faction. They advocated a bloodletting strategy, draining the enemy over time until it died. On the other hand, the Eastern faction, made up primarily of people involved in the Eastern Army Group, prioritized the Eastern Front. They advocated a decisive strategy to end the war quickly with encirclement and annihilation of enemy forces. The Western faction strongly condemned the idea of a decisive battle as too risky. Zatour especially, who was an adherent of attritional containment doctrine, wanted to avoid large-scale offensives. Trench warfare had taught them the merit of decentralized advances and encirclement tactics, but nonetheless he was extremely skeptical of going on an offensive while their enemy held the advantage. Meanwhile, the Eastern faction proposed their strategy on the premise that the Federation would have numerical superiority. Under that assumption, the Western faction's proposed plan had to be deemed unrealistic. What they set their sights on next was an attract and annihilate strategy employing their mobility along interior lines. It was an application of a method proposed by Zatour, who had encircled and annihilated It was an application of a method proposed by Zatour, who had encircled and annihilated the bloodied and weakened Republican army at the end of the First Battle of the Rhine. The Eastern faction focused on the mobile aspects and saw the tantalizing prospect of an encirclement. While the attritional containment doctrine endlessly piled up corpses, the decisive battle doctrine would limit losses by ending everything in one single stroke, achieving a final victory. The Eastern faction used that logic to rebel against the passivity of the mainstream General Staff faction. It ended up that they would test their theory in an operation on the Eastern Front against the Federation army that had broken through the Imperial lines after the initial sneak attack. They succeeded in surrounding an invading force of 400,000 Federation soldiers with a mere 150,000 in Trauzenberg. Compared to the Imperial losses of 10,500 men, the Federation lost 150,000. 90,000 of which were taken prisoner, with the rest being fatalities. Though tables hadn't completely overturned their numerical inferiority, and they let some remnants of their enemy escape, the battle was considered solid precedent for the Eastern faction's theory. On the heels of that success, the Eastern faction began planning how to increase their gains and bring the war to an early close. At that time, a movement that supported any prospect of an early end to the war appeared in opposition to the cabinet and the imperial family's fears of heavy casualties. As the mainstream group in the general staff, the Western faction tried to argue against them, but the Eastern faction stressed their success in the Battle of Traunsberg, literally trouncing the enemy. More than anything, the Eastern faction's achievements were so much more persuasive than the Western faction's victory on the Rhine front, which had come at the cost of a mountain of imperial corpses. Thus, the General Staff proposed and carried out a single plan. It was called Operation Lakeside. The idea was to push up the front lines via a major offensive. It was emphatically criticized from several quarters for being high risk, high return, but in the end, they bulldozed all opposition and pushed it through. It was ordered as Order Number 41. Thus, the Imperial Army's great offensive in the east became known as Operation Number 41, or colloquially as Operation Lakeside. The Imperial Army General Staff's Order Number 41 was top secret. It was delivered by officers themselves. Defensive combat in the Federation was nearing its end. We had already destroyed the Federation's reserves at Traunsberg. The situation was fluid, but the Federation's surplus forces were drying up quickly, and it had practically lost the advantage it had seized in the initial sneak attack. Amid these circumstances, the Imperial Army was tasked with seizing the initiative as soon as weather and ground conditions improved. The objective was to thoroughly annihilate the remaining forces the Federation Army had been holding onto and, to the extent possible, incapacitate their critical field army. In order to accomplish that, it first sent its main forces into the main operation in the east. Then, in order to defend their expanded lines, a mobile corps was formed. The general plan was to mop up the enemies on the front and take the road and supply base along the former forwardmost line. The top priority, however, was to take out the remaining enemy forces, and at the very bottom there was a comment that said, "Troops, our counterattack is soon at hand." New scene here. July 8th, Unified Year, 1926. Federation Capital, Moscova. Large subterranean meeting room. Everyone present was clearly depressed. All they needed to do was propose a single constructive idea, but they were useless failures, worried only about what Comrade Secretary Joseph thought. How utterly pathetic, lamented Mr. Loria, who was working diligently for the people, the nation, and the party on that day as well. He had a dream. He would spare no effort in making it come true. His efforts were so great, he could boast that he was the hardest-working technocrat in all the Federation. And it was because of that ambition that he felt vigorous and young. Or rather, it was precisely because he had a dream that life was worth living. What's the difference between a lazy oaf who doesn't know what they desire and someone in the Lagraille? Okay, editor's note here. Someone in the Lagraille, or Lagraille. A Lagraille is a system of concentration and labor camps. By the way, the brilliant Soviets were against slave labor. Ostensibly, anyway. That is an interesting thing there. So that's probably a reference to the whole Gulag system and the Gulag archipelago, so to speak. There's a book on that I would highly recommend by that, God, what the hell's the name of that Russian author? But it's of the same name, Gulag Archipelago. I would highly recommend reading it to anybody who's listening. It's definitely well worth your time. Though it is rather long, so be prepared. In either case, continuing here from where we left off. And it was because of that ambition that he felt so young. Or rather, it was precisely because he had a dream that life was worth living. What's the difference between a lazy oaf who doesn't know what they desire and someone in the Lagrai? With that on his mind, Loria got down to work for the time being. To sum up our report, Comrade General Secretary, the Imperial Army is concentrating a large force in the region of the eastern border. It seems that, just as you've thought, they will launch a counteroffensive soon. The report was so long it wasn't worth listening to. In the Commissariat for Internal Affairs, if a field report wasn't kept to 3 lines, he would send the author to the Lagrai for the crime of inefficiency. Come to think of it, the Federation was far too inefficient. Bureaucracy was already spreading, and regrettably, not a single system functioned in a simplistic way. He could understand very well why Comrade General Secretary was irritated. Thanks. Now then, comrades, that is our situation. What do you think? The question implicitly requested a plan for a solution. Really, it was dangerous to answer Comrade General Secretary Yosef's questions. If you gave an opinion and it went well, you could be given credit and authority. But if you were too successful, you would be purged as someone threatening his position. Even if that didn't happen, there was still the danger of getting involved in, and then ruined by, internal party struggles. If you failed, on the other hand, you'd be forced to suffer the consequences right then and there. With that in mind, it was obvious why everyone stared at Comrade General Secretary Yosef with earnest resolve, yet no one dared open their mouth. That said, like this, the inepts might as well have had their necks on the chopping block for us already. He furiously clenched his pen and was seized by the urge to stab it right through the document. This was utterly pointless. There was no time to lose, and things were far from ideal. Evidently, I will eventually send you all to the Lagrai, he decided. But first he made up his mind about what to do in the near term. Comrade General Secretary, we have succeeded in drawing the enemy in. Now I think we should make it so they can't pull out. And you would do this how? Let's bait a hook and have them bite it. What if we seeded the region near the border? The Federation's territory was vast, but the development of its infrastructure was conveniently lagging behind. For the country, it was a problem. But, by the same token, it also created poor conditions for any advancing army. If the Federation could draw the Empire into an attritional battle on their lines, the advantage would be theirs. It was simple. Even a child could understand by simply looking at a map. The Federation's vast territory, with which it could defend in depth, was a good ally. Imagine 10 people so strong it would take 10 to beat each one. If those 10 people could take on 100, it might be hard to beat them even with only 100 people. But with 100 against 1, they could surely win. If the enemy spread out, they could win with numbers. It was only a matter of course, really. There is no enemy who can't be crushed and killed with numbers, no matter how strong they are. All they needed to do was draw in the thinned-out enemy forces and batter them. Or perhaps create a place where they could lure them into a futile attrition battle. For example, a city whose capture would have significant political effects, a place they wouldn't be able to give up once they took it. A city, in addition to having no resources, would be effective for drawing them into an urban battle of attrition. The most apt place near the front lines was Yosefgrad. It would be typical for them to order the Federation army to guard the city with their lives. If the Imperial army captured the city, they would probably never let it go, especially if our propaganda kept saying that we would take it back at all costs. And regardless of what would happen if the Federation challenged the Empire's mobile army to a field battle, in a battle of attrition, the Federation's numerical advantage would begin to take effect. In other words, Dropping back for the Federation Army would mean securing strategic depth. The Imperial Army might get space, but the Federation Army would get time to reorganize. Comrade Loria, say what you will, but that puts the Federation's honor at stake. Are you perhaps saying we should give land to the Empire under the direction of our great commander, Comrade General Secretary? But the responses came from idiots who made his head hurt. If you looked, you could see how they flaunted their allegiance. It disgusted him to be contested by those imbeciles who were capable only of blindly following and obedience. Ugh, shut up! Comrade General Secretary, may I please continue, sir? I'll put those guys first on the list of people to send to the Legrai. I swear it, he thought as he addressed the formal leader of the proceedings. At least Comrade General Secretary Yosef trusted him. Even if he said something that displeased him, it was purely out of loyalty. Go ahead, Loria. And dictators tend to be sensitive to those sort of things. Of course, Loria knew that only from experience, but even still. Anyhow, the highest authority figure present waved a hand to have the protesters settle down and allowed Loria to continue. Thank you, sir. Loria understood. He gave an exaggerated expression of gratitude, stood, and walked over to the map on the wall. It was a map describing their situation. What pained him was the crushing blow the Federation forces had suffered in Traunsenberg due to the major offensive those morons had insisted on. Allow me to reread that. And dictators tend to be sensitive to those sort of things. Of course, Loria knew that only from experience, but even still. Anyhow, the highest authority figure present waved a hand to have the protesters settle down and allowed Loria to continue. Thank you, sir. Loria understood. He gave an exaggerated expression of gratitude, stood, and walked over to the map on the wall. It was a map describing their situation. What pained him was the crushing blow the Federation forces had suffered in Traunsenberg due to the major offensive those morons had insisted on. But apparently, the Imperial Army was also full of numbskulls. The desire to attack on impulse is a defect of soldiers in general. Loria chuckled to himself in his head at the thought. They simply didn't understand the nature of invading enemy territory. Cutting to the chase, if we retreat, we can force the Imperial Army into a battle of attrition. Furthermore, only by retreating can we force them into urban combat in a number of strategically important points. There were some factories and the transportation network in the region to consider, but the chaos of an urban battle was optimal for the Federation right now. Combat in cities would take place on a fairly large scale. Civilian casualties would be high, but that was acceptable. For the Federation Army, which was qualitatively inferior to the Imperial Army, that held a rather important meaning. This is my personal opinion, but I don't see any reason we should have to fight in the ring our opponents feel at home in. We want the opposite. It's in the tight quarters of urban combat that we can use the advantage of our numbers. Loria would guarantee that an urban battle was the optimal place if you wanted freshly conscripted troops to fight halfway decently. Or rather, it could be said that he had no other ideas about how to wage an actual war with the Empire effectively. He had some of his political officers on the front lines reporting both Imperial and Federation losses. The ratios were never better than 1 to 5. But the scale of the Federation Army was simply overwhelming. When it came to slugging it out in a city, organized combat and mobile battles, all those disciplined actions the Imperial Army specialized in, would be of only limited use. With the pure gaze of a mathematician, Loria calculated for their victory. If we can get our attrition ratios even slightly more equal, the Empire will be the one who surrenders in the end. If they could lower their losses even slightly, hard math would give the Federation an overwhelming advantage. They could also increase their opponent's losses a little bit. Loria sneered at that point. Ah, soldiers are such obnoxious creatures. They obsess over honor and appearance plus pride. It's too much. But as long as they keep winning, the importance of the land will grow on its own. Pyrrhus was great because he realized his victory was going to be Pyrrhic and had managed to retreat in time. Most generals would have been blinded by their own success and expanded the lines in pursuit of further results. Naturally, the Imperial Army would invade Federation territory to increase their gains. But to achieve that, it would be forced to engage in battle over cities. Once that happens, they won't be able to retreat even if they want to. Yes, then they would need to reinforce their units to tighten their defenses, and they would be paralyzed. The mobile ones who were so skilled at encirclement tactics would be stuck allotting more and more manpower to defend a fixed position. Then all that's left for us is to swoop in and retake our lost territory. The Federation army would simply employ their numbers to encircle and annihilate them. And maybe it would be good to send in some spies via a third-party country to agitate public opinion in the Empire against the war. Then they really wouldn't be able to pull out. Or I should say perhaps towards the war. Of course, so that we can resist to the last, Internal Affairs plans to dispatch blocking units behind various units fighting in the city. They also required some live bait to lure them in. We would take anyone who had made anti-Federation remarks, as well as ethnic nationalists and reactionaries, then grind them down to nothing against the Imperial Army. Loria spoke matter-of-factly, but internally he felt like bemoaning the silent, trembling party executives and their stupidity. When he looked around the room, he saw a few horror-stricken faces among them. You people with your fake morals only pretend to be virtuous. There couldn't possibly be a good person here. He wanted to jeer. At least I'm honest about it. I'm confident that we'll then be able to crush the Imperials using a wall of civilians we'll force to volunteer for the army and the riffraff from the concentration camps. They would preserve the soldiers who were loyal to the establishment whilst disposing of potentially dangerous elements at the same time. No, if we put it another way, all the Federation's people will heroically resist the invaders. And it wouldn't be through a purge, but sacrifice for the fatherland. Or they should say here, motherland, because they were talking about Russia here. And it wouldn't be through a purge, but sacrifice for the motherland. It wasn't someone from the establishment who would perform the purges, but their enemy, the Imperial Army. There was no need for the party to get its hands dirty this time. Loria was surprised by his own acumen. I like the way this guy thinks. Shit. When their hopes and dreams are the motivator, people exhibit unbelievable strength and abundant creativity. Under the leadership of Comrade General Secretary all the Federation's civilians will rise up as partisans and fight to the last. Don't you think that would be wonderful? I see. That could be an effective proposal, yes. At least everyone could understand that much. No one questioned the ethical values, whether he was right or wrong. So the idea was accepted very easily. Thank you. All right, I'll put you in charge of that, Comrade Loria. But you know failure is unacceptable, don't you? Of course. Please leave everything to me, sir. Failure is unacceptable. The warning was accompanied by a harsh gaze. A chill went up Loria's spine, but he didn't avert his eyes. He continued looking back, determined. For him, a chill went up Loria's spine, but he didn't avert his eyes. He continued looking back, determined. For him, this was part of fulfilling his dream. Comrade General Secretary, I hate to ask for this in return, but there is one thing. If there are supplies you need, I'll approve them. What is it? Sir, it's about the criminal who bombed Moscova. I'd like to personally be the one to judge her. That fairy. I want her. No matter what it takes, I'll do anything. I've got to have her for myself. We must proceed very carefully. Yes, very carefully with that matter. I can't promise you, Comrade Loria. Loria had brought up that detestable situation in front of the General Secretary of all people. That alone was stepping on the tiger's tail. In fact, the hand holding his pen was visibly shaking from rage and humiliation at the remark. Comrade General Secretary, then I'd at least like to have the little girl. He knew it was reckless. But even so, there were times a man just had to act. Comrade Loria, is she your type? Of course, that's not exactly the right way to express it, but there were things he had to do, even if it meant sacrificing everything. There are times in life that you just have to speak up. What? Sir, she's what you would call my ideal. I would so very much, like to make her gasp beneath me. Pure determination. Loria could only plead. Was hoping all he could do? No. He acted. He spoke his mind. Would his hopes be allowed? That was something only God knew. They should perhaps have translated it as, that was something God alone knew. But Loria had made up his mind. He had already decided. If they wanted to laugh at him as a fool, he would let them, as long as he could have her. Fine. If it will dispel your anxiety, then I shall allow it. You can count on me, sir. I'll eradicate every obstruction and enemy to make this operation a success, guaranteed. And so, Loria had acquired the wings he needed to make his dream come true. As soon as the meeting ended, he jumped into his car and sped back to headquarters, which was being rebuilt, to get back to work. The General Secretary gave me permission. Now I just have to catch her. The situation was steadily evolving to make his dream a real possibility. That sense of fulfillment made him forget his age. He felt giddy and young again. He was convinced he had lost the pure-hearted anticipation of a child long ago, so he was genuinely surprised at himself. The Imperial Army is walking right into my trap. If this goes well, I'm sure I'll be able to lure that Salamander Kampfgruppe, or whatever they called themselves, deep into our territory. And when that happens... But at the same time, he had the caution of a mature adult. He had his unadulterated feelings, yes, but he also had learned patience, which is not to say that he wasn't looking forward to the fun at the end. I guess it's one more reason to put up the best fight we can. I wonder how the army's morale is. Loria wasn't about to spare any effort, so he called up the officers in charge to ask. To him, people who could do only so much before the only thing left was waiting for fate. So he would do everything he possibly could in order to avoid regrets. Probably not very high, he surmised. We have reports that desertions are on the rise. I guess we should send more blocking units than originally planned. Choose the members from within internal affairs. Send them as soon as possible. Naturally, He would make every move possible to achieve his dream. As a person chasing that dream, he would sacrifice everything he had for his ideal. His devotion was great enough that he was prepared to make an enemy of the entire world if necessary. Understood, sir. And improve conditions in the concentration camps. But he also understood. He knew the importance of hopes and dreams. Without them, people couldn't live as human beings. But that's... Instead of throwing them in there for 10 years, we should treat them well for a month and then pit them against the Imperial Army. Our national resources should be used in a meaningful and efficient way. You don't understand even that much? Still, Loria was tolerant of even his fretting subordinate. He was a missionary preaching hopes and dreams. People needed happiness, which meant that people, including himself, needed to be happy. In other words, even prisoners should be used efficiently. If you understand, then get it done. Do excuse me, sir. I'll get on that right away. If necessary, punish some camp guards. If necessary, punish some camp guards and make an example of them. If progress comes too slowly, you'll be dealt with as well, so do bear that in mind. Everyone needed to work hard. He knew that people valued the chance to pursue their dreams. If their dream was staying alive, they would work for it. Yes, sir. Look, all you need to do is what needs to be done. Remember that. So, troops, please hurry up and show me you can do this, he wished, earnestly, just barely suppressing his inner conflict. All right, get going. Hurry up and bring that fairy to me. New scene here. July 18th, Unified Year, 1926. The Eastern Lines. Good day, everyone. Do you like clean air and a beautiful night sky? Wouldn't you like to lie down on the earth amid a soft, gentle breeze and watch clouds drifting off into forever? The city is overly mechanized and rigid in its standardization. It has no personality. Let's take a step into the outside world, gentlemen. I'm sure we'll find an abundance of the nature we're meant to return to. Our addiction to machines and over-reliance on cars might make you think walking on the earth is a little crazy. But please remember, our ancestors walked, and so too do we. So why not learn from our forebears and take a little stroll outside? Ah, I apologize. My introductory remarks have gone on for too long. How embarrassing. I am the officer in command of the General Staff's Salamander Kampfgruppe, Lieutenant Colonel Tanya von Degrichow. My current job is armed hiking. All I have to do is go on and on, by motorcycle or armored vehicle, across the muddy earth. Our actual mission is to support the flank of the Imperial Eastern Army Group's northern cluster. You could say it's the newly formed Salamander Kampfgruppe's flank patrol mission. Well, I heard our friends in the east beat the invading enemy's reserves in Traunsenberg. The General Staff doesn't imagine they'll show up again tomorrow, so let's relax and take it easy. Yep, relax. I don't want to get too involved, you see. To be specific, this should be like a game of ding-dong ditch, so we can always just run away. The Saga of Tanya the Evil, Volume 4, Dabit Deus his quoque finem fini. Das ist Ende for Volume 4. Here on page 317. That was actually really fun. I quite enjoyed it. And here on the next page, we can see a picture of Tanya sitting in what appears to be the sidecar of a motorbike, having a leisurely nap and yawning as she's roaring off into the muddy countryside of the Eastern Lines. Just chillin'. Enjoying life and just chillin'. It's beautiful. And she doesn't have a care in the world. All right. Now here we have the appendixes. Appendixes and commentary. Achtung, attention. Next page here, page 320. Commentary. This here is sort of delineating what happened in this book and what steps were taken throughout the course of the war. March 15th, Unified Year 1926. The Imperial Army General Staff orders an urgent cross-border operation after picking up signs that the Federation Army is actively mobilizing. The 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion begins sneaking into the Federation. That's map 1 there. Map 2. At the outset of the war, they incapacitate the Federation Army's artillery position, including their railway guns. The same day, the on-guard Eastern Army Group abandons the border due to railway gun fire and other heavy bombardment. It shifts into delaying battles while waiting for the Great Army's arrival. The 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion begins a distraction operation on orders from the General Staff. It succeeds in striking the Federation's capital, Moscova. Map 3. The Imperial Army continues its fighting retreat all along the eastern lines. The Federation Army continues advancing west along 3 routes. The Imperial Army General Staff plans to use the interior lines strategy to counter and destroy each group. The 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion heads to Tegenhof per a rescue request from the Eastern Army Group. They engage in a mobile defense battle to aid the besieged town. By clashing with the Federation's strategic reserves, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion exhausts itself, but manages to help hold Tegenhof, as well as pin and grind down the enemy reserves. Map 4. The Imperial Army launches a new mobile operation with Tegenhof as its axis. It succeeds in striking the weakened Federation reserves in their weakest point. Next page here, Map 5. In the series of engagements known collectively as the Battle of Traunsenberg, the Imperial Army seizes and... In the series of engagements known collectively as the Battle of Traunsenberg, the Imperial Army seizes the initiative in the east. Map 6. Following the political fallout of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion's attack on Moscova, Major Tanya von Degrachov and her troops are transferred to the west. The 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion participates in the Western Air Battle as part of their combat skills research. After a few skirmishes, they perform their first combat search and rescue mission over Commonwealth territory. During the mission, Major Tanya von Degrachov knocks Mary Sue out of the sky, though she survives. Lieutenant Colonel von Degrachov forms the Salamander Kampfgruppe with the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion as its key unit. The Salamander Kampfgruppe heads for the fierce fighting on the Eastern Front. General Commentary. During the early stages of the war in the East, the Imperial Army, which combined mobility and impact in an extremely successful way, was able to counterattack across all areas and seize the initiative. Overall, the Empire seemed to have the advantage. But the Imperial Army's systems were constantly overburdened, and the General Staff was intimately aware that they couldn't be optimistic, especially when it came to the rate of attrition. Meanwhile, though the Federation stumbled in the beginning, it has everything necessary to enact a good defense in depth. Though the Imperial Army has the initiative, the situation remains fluid. Both sides will probably aim for a more decisive victory from here on out. Now here on the next page here, which I do believe would be page 325, though it is not marked, we have the afterword by Mr. Carlo Zen himself. Afterword. To everyone who picked up Volume 4, I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. But I said I would put it out in early summer. And it's June. It's June, by God. And I think it's fine to say that the last day of June is still undoubtedly early summer. So I don't think it's out of the question to make a strong argument and say I delivered perfectly according to plan. One other thing, and due to space constraints I can't get into all the details, but beware of the crooked propaganda claiming that Carlo Zen is not a light novel author. Youjo Senki, The Saga of Tanya the Evil, is unmistakably a light novel. By definition, it is definitely a light novel. I must stress this point. This is important, so I'll say it again. It's totally a light novel, regardless of how thick it is. Now that the important announcements are out of the way, on to the meat of this afterward. Here we are on Volume 4 of Youjo Senki, The Saga of Tanya the Evil. To be honest, it's such a wild title, I wasn't sure I would be able to keep going this long. So I feel I've been blessed with unexpected luck. I hope to receive your continued patronage. Nothing would make me happier. A warm thank you to Tsubakiya Design for the design of this text, Ukita for the proofing, my editor, Fujita, and most of all, to the illustrator who always does such wonderful illustrations, Shinobu Shinotsuki. Now then, I firmly believe I have a moral duty to take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt apology to Shinotsuki for the horrible thing I did. Shinotsuki, who didn't really understand the fascination of railway guns, is now tainted. Among the various factors, I can't deny my responsibility in convincing people to say, quote, anti-material rifles are cool, huh? But how could I help it? Sorry, but railway guns are just poetry in action. I can't help it. Readers, please don't forget. Youjo Senki, The Saga of Tanya the Evil, is made by condensing that romance and hobby, adding water to create a soup stock of hobby and romance, carefully seasoning the romance with more hobby, and then throwing in an unbelievable amount of hardcore stuff. And so, the story is heading to the east. I told my editor the war on the Eastern Front, quote, won't take too long, end quote. So I figure I'll finish it off pretty quickly. It's only a little part of humanity's long history since we began recording it, so in the grand scheme of things, it should be short. But just because it's short doesn't mean you can let your guard down. If you let yourself get lured in without thinking, you might find yourself swooning over railway guns. You might find yourself swooning over railway guns. Of course, maybe that warning is coming a bit too late for those of you who have been kind enough to read up through Volume 4. June 2015, from Carlo Zen. So, just a little brief bit of analysis on his written statements here. So, all this talk about railway guns seems to imply that the Japanese portion of the fan base took offense at the way the railway guns were drawn in this text, or the fact that they were incorporated. As for the talk about anti-material rifles are cool, huh, is probably a reference to a meme from a show, in a show called, God, the name escapes me right now, but it's basically the show. It's a show about vampires, and there's this thing where this chick says bitches love cannons, and it became a meme, and it's her shooting an anti-material rifle at vampires or something. I'm guessing that's a reference. So evidently he's replying directly to members of the Japanese fan base and literally acknowledging the memes they're sending to him in reference to his seeming obsession with railway guns. But I don't know the context of all this. This is all like roughly 4 years in the past now, this being 2019, almost summer now, it's May. So, yeah, I can't speak to that. On the last page of the text, we have another ad that was inserted by the publisher, Yen On and Yen Press, which basically says, have you been turned on to light novels yet? And they're trying to push, it looks like, Sword Art Online, Excel World, Spice and Wolf. Is it wrong to pick up girls in a dungeon? Really? Certain Magical Index and another. Not really my thing, any of those. Some of them I have actually read or seen the shows for. Now, what I'm going to do next is I am going to reread the section on the back and then do a bit of a debrief. So, on the back of the text, as we read in the first video of this particular book, as soon as Major Tanya von Degrachow returns from combat on the sandblasted southern front, her battalion is handed incredibly confusing orders that send them eastward. Under the guise of a training exercise, Tanya and her troops infiltrate Federation territory in absolute secrecy, only to find that the unimaginable has occurred. Federation forces are preparing for war. It takes just a single thunderous roar of a railway gun to shatter their disbelief and thrust the Empire into yet another ferocious battle. From now on, there will be no way forward except through victory, even if it means making the entire world their enemy. Well then, Volume 4 has not failed and certainly has not disappointed. It was, quite frankly, spectacular. I loved it. Now then, on the subject of Volume 5 and other matters, let's tackle Volume 5 first. So, I received Volume 5 in the mail some months ago, although I regrettably haven't quite gotten around to starting it as yet. Far too busy between work and school and various other matters. But it will be coming, and that's a promise. At the moment, I've got, let me see, full-time 10-hour shifts and one class over the summer, but my weekends are open, so yeah, if I dedicate a day or two a week to recording and editing and all the rest, then you should expect to have roughly an upload once every 2 to 3 weeks, or roughly a month at most. So yeah, that will come in short order. Now then, other things worthy of discussion. As you will likely already know, on May 16th, it has been announced that the Youjo Senki movie will be receiving a release in the United States. Today is presently May the, if I'm not mistaken here, yes, today is, that's not quite right. What is today's date here? Yes, May 5th. Today is May 5th, 2019, when I am finishing off this recording here. Started a little earlier in the week. So, yeah, in the very near future, on May 16th, the movie is coming in all of 11 days to North America. And I'm thinking of going down there, which will be very, very good if I can manage to fit it into my schedule. I do have class that evening, but so long as it's a morning time, I will manage it. In terms of other things that I've been up to of late, so just this morning I went to the final day for an auction selling off stuff from a show called Man in the High Castle that I was a background extra on for the final episode. I may have gone a little overboard, but it was definitely thoroughly enjoyable. A lot of cool stuff to find, although sensing a pattern here, just as before, no really noticeable German or Japanese Imperial stuff, really. Basically, the Japanese Imperial uniforms and stuff went up for sale. All the German ones, nada. They basically threw them all out and probably burned them, never to be seen again, even though some of them were irreplaceable originals. Not thrilled about that. I did manage to find basically just chunks of equipment scattered all over the place and cobbled together a few roughly North Africa campaign uniform-ish things, but they're missing all the little Waffenfarbe and, you know, all the beautiful little stickers, and not stickers, whatever you call them, the things that actually identify rank insignia and all the rest. Most of them are missing that, so that's unfortunate, but to be expected. So I guess I can't get originals of those because the originals were presumably sheared off and destroyed, but I may be able to import reproduction ones and attach to the original uniforms for the purposes of reenactments and all the rest. Other than that, I also managed to pick up 2 kimonos for myself and a bunch of other niceties, shall we say, and it's going to be nice. Other things of interest, some summer plans, planning on doing some overnight hiking in about a week. So yeah, in the event that I don't get back to you guys as soon as planned, well, that's probably why. I may be a week or 2 behind schedule as a consequence of that. Regardless, I'm happy you guys have stuck with me this long, and Volume 5 will be coming out in various segments probably over the next 3-4 weeks-ish. So look forward to that, and here's hoping that we all get to see the movie. I mean, ooh, it's going to be so much fun. Anyway, so without further ado, it's now 10:02 p.m. here, so I leave you off on that. So thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. Auf Wiedersehen.
It's got like 20 people holed up inside of it. We gotta do something.
We have orders to contain this threat by any means necessary.
Your orders were to clear that sector.
They're okay, they're just scared shitless. I think it's—
Son, you don't think! We're in the field, soldier. We kill them all. That's an order.
No.
I need soldiers! I don't need anybody else but soldiers!
Go to hell.
What? Kurst and Harald are dead?
A random enemy shell struck their pillbox while they were awaiting orders at the rear. It's a real shame.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to know.
What is it?
Bad news. About Corporals Kurst and Harald.
Yes, they're dead.
But how do you know that?
It was inevitable, really. A pillbox is exposed. It doesn't move.
Mutinous insurrection is punishable by death.
A complete and utter monster in the form of a little girl.